Hello, everyone. This is Greg Scorzo, and you're listening to the Code of Publishing Podcast number 2. Today, we're going to be doing The Art of Thinking with Karen Harradine. Karen Harradine, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most interesting and provocative journalists doing op-ed pieces in the UK. She's primarily known for her work in The Conservative Woman, but is published in other places, including Culture on the Offensive. So today is the first of a two-part series that we're going to do with Karen. So half of our conversation will be uploaded this week. The other half will be uploaded next week, part 2, where we discuss Karen's views on the persecution of Christians and death and grief. This week, part 1, will be concerning Karen's views on left-wing politics, COVID restrictions, the United Nations, anti-Western bias, the political biases of the police, agency and personal responsibility, identity politics, post-liberal Puritanism, feminism, trans activism, environmental protests, and the precarious state of our civil liberties. What I love about your writing is you're not a shy writer at all.
I guess it's because I just feel I can't write anything that is not my truth. I can't write anything that is not in my mind. I can't invent things. I can't make things up. I need to write what I really, really think. And if I stop myself from doing that, then the writing process doesn't happen for me. So I guess my brain isn't shy, but my everyday personality is a little shy. And the two just don't meet.
Yeah, well, you're very passionate and very strong-willed in your writing. There's nothing in the writing that would suggest that you're in any way a shy person.
I'm quite shy. I mean, I do like to chat, etc. But I'm this shy that if I go to a restaurant, well, the time before we were allowed to go to restaurants,
Yeah.
and when I go to a restaurant with Will or something, I always make him go first because I'm too shy to ask for a table. As a very shy child, a very shy teenager. I think people mistake the fact that because I have quite a loud South African voice and I am talkative and friendly, I hope, that I'm not shy, but I am shy and I'm an introverted person. So I guess I find writing a way to express myself more than I can when talking.
So you are, if I'm honest, one of my favorite op-ed writers doing stuff at the moment. I found your writing, I think it was in 2018, maybe.
Yeah.
Because of things that you were writing at that time for The Conservative Woman, which is, I think, your primary outlet for op-eds, even today, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that I was struck by about your writing, which is why I'm a fan, is on the one hand, it's very passionate and it can be quite scathing at times, like Brendan O'Neill, for instance. But it's also simultaneously very nuanced.
I think I am a passionate, emotional person. I'm very emotional, and I guess that kind of comes out in my writing. If I believe something, I believe it with all my being, my heart and soul. I'm not kind of wishy-washy on anything, so that will come out. The nuance is because I've learned to write like that because of Kathy Janelle, the editor of Con Woman. She's really been writing for Conservative Women now for 5 years, and I've learned a lot on how to write from Kathy and also from you, Greg, for the things I've written for you. Having great editors helps me kind of focus the emotional feelings that I have about this topic that I'm writing on, and to make sure that it doesn't come across as some rant, but it is nuanced and calm as much as I can. And also, I like to back up my opinions with evidence and detail. And that's why I add a lot of links in to say, this is not just me thinking this. Look at the evidence over here. Which kind of takes it away from just having one long rant into something far more nuanced and evidence-based. And I think that helps.
Yeah, well, that certainly comes across in the prose. To communicate to the audience members who don't already know this, Karen Harradine has written for Culture on the Offensive, And we are going to be discussing later on in this podcast one of the pieces she wrote for us on death, which is a very unusual piece in your collection of work, because I think it's
Yes.
the only piece that you've written that's been published which isn't specifically about a political issue, but it's about something personal.
Yeah,
So I
it's
was very happy to be able to give you a platform to do that.
thank you, Greg. It's my most personal piece that I've ever written, and it was very cathartic. Thank you for giving me the space to do it.
So going back into your career and its origins a little bit as a writer, um, just give us some sense of like, how did you start writing about politics? Where did this come from? When did you start writing these pieces?
Oh, so I guess I grew up with a father who made me read when I was like 5 onwards at least 4 different newspapers a day.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day where there was no internet or anything like that. And he would buy all these newspapers and he would say, Kaki, which is my family nickname, read these every day forever. Read 4 newspapers at least every day. And I guess my politics started from there. I guess growing up in apartheid South Africa, you have to be aware of politics unless you want to keep your head in the sand and not be aware of what was going on to the majority of your fellow South Africans. So I had as well as being Jewish, and my father was a very, very strong Zionist. So I was always aware of what was going on in Israel and Middle East from literally from the age of 5, 6 years old. My father would discuss this with me. There was never, my parents were very anti-apartheid, so there was always a discussion about that in our house. So I grew up with politics. I did in South Africa a degree in journalism. I never used it. I never went into it for various reasons. When I immigrated to this country in 1998, I did crappy jobs, secretarial jobs, call center jobs, etc. As an immigrant, you do whatever you can to survive. But I kept up my interest in politics. I read everything, Greg. I don't just stick to kind of reading conservative press or the left-wing press. So I read the whole lot every single day. I have my favorite writers that I like to read, but I read as much as I can, as broadly as I can. And I've been doing this for 30, oh goodness, no, at least 45 years of my life, reading everything. I don't stick to an echo chamber. I think that helps. And then basically, around about 2013, I decided to start studying again. And the local university where we were living offered a postgraduate degree in journalism. So I thought, well, let me just go for it and just do that part-time. And then I started as part of the journalism, postgraduate journalism degree. I started writing theatre and art and dance reviews for a local magazine in Suffolk, which I had great fun doing. And then I started doing a few op-eds for the Times of Israel blogs. Anybody can do that. But I started cutting my teeth a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as I finished studying, Will got a job in Singapore. So off I went to Singapore, never having gone to the Far East in my entire life.
So you're referring to William Harradine, your husband?
Yes, my husband, yes. And I wasn't allowed to work there because of visa stuff. So I started to write more. And I'd been reading conservative women since it really started a couple of years before. And at that stage, just before I started writing, Labour had elected Jeremy Corbyn as the leader. And I'd been reading about Corbyn for a long time because he'd been involved in a lot of anti-Israel stuff. And, I'd kept up my politics. And so I sent Kathy an idea for a blog saying I'd like to write on the dangers that Corbyn is posing to British Jews with anti-Semitism and anti-Israel stuff. Can I write something for you? And she said yes, and it was published way beyond anything I ever expected. And then I just started to write more, and now, I've written 201 pieces for Con Women. I think it's 3 for you, and a couple of others for others. But mainly it's been, it's kind of snowballed from that. And before I knew it, I was spending most of my time in the last 5 years writing on British politics and global politics as well, because I find that very interesting. So yeah, that's kind of how it started.
Fabulous. So one thing I've always been interested in is it seems like from what you told me, you've had a bit of a journey. Like you
Yes.
were maybe 15 or 20 years ago, not as conservative as you are now. Would you say that's fair
Yeah,
to say?
yeah. And I wouldn't even call I mean, it's, I think very much, I've never kind of pigeonholed myself into an ideology. I think it's because the form of ideologies keeps shifting the whole time. Like the left now, it's not the left that it was 30, 40 years ago. The conservatives, like if you take the Tory parties, I mean, I call them basically Labour-like greenies. The whole concept of conservatism or liberalism, it keeps shifting all the time. So I identify myself by what I am not. I am not of the left. But I guess 20, 30 years ago, I was more left wing than I am now. My values are more conservative now, but I am older. So I think, as you get older, you become more conservative normally. But I've never belonged to any political party, and I never will.
So when you say you are a conservative now, or a conservative by the standards of 2021, let's say, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to be a conservative today?
I think conservatism means to me very much small government. I grew up in apartheid South Africa where it was big, big government. I grew up in a police state. I have an innate distaste and fear and disgust of big government. This is why I was always a passionate Brexiteer. The EU is big government epitomized. The Tories have morphed into huge big government. So for me, it's small government. I believe very much that you do need some sort of a welfare state. Having grown up in South Africa where there was no welfare state, people just literally could lose their job and die from starvation a few weeks later. A progressive society, in terms of a real progression, a democratic society needs some welfare. But it also means to value people's individuality in terms of their individual responsibility. Unfortunately, when you have big state government like we have now, it infantilizes people, it takes away people's responsibility, very much about personal responsibility, needing a safety net, but small government, really conservative spending and staying away from woke ideology. To me, that is what conservatism should be.
And do you think that there is a place in conservative ideology for having a general worry, let's say, about big business encroaching on the liberties of human beings and maybe doing things that government should regulate to protect people?
I think so. I mean, I'm not a conventional conservative in any way. I think for me, it's particularly what's happened now. If you look at some of the big businesses that have expanded through the whole COVID-19 debacle, like Amazon's has totally increased their profits, whereas small and medium businesses in this country have been smashed to pieces. Small, medium business enterprises are the backbone of this country. Well, they were. And as a conservative, those are the ones that should be supported. I think you do need a bit of government regulation. I'm not against no government regulation, but at the moment, what we're seeing is big business and government working together to literally smash small businesses and medium businesses. And that to me goes against what conservatism should be.
Interesting. So, would you be in favor of anti monopoly legislation, for instance?
I think I would be, yes.
And also, do you worry about the relationship between labor and capital and the exploitation of the worker the way that left wing people do typically?
Absolutely. I mean, the wages that in this country are actually really bad. People, for immigrants like myself, it was an interesting experience. Like to come here, not knowing anything about benefits, etc., and then you go and get a crappy job that pays hardly anything, and you have a tough time. You're not on any benefits. You're not on any housing housing help or anything like that. Doing crappy, low-paid jobs and struggling. I think it's and my experience when first coming as an immigrant to this country, I think a lot of people have a similar experience. The wages in this country are very low because they are supplemented by government payments like benefits, etc. And I think one of the issues is, there's a huge discrepancy between what you get paid as like a secretary in a medium small company and what the boss will be paid. And you're both living in London and you can barely afford to buy yourself shoes, which happened to me. But the boss has a nice big house in a nice part of London. So there's a huge discrepancy and it has to be addressed. But the problem that we've got now is we're so far away from readdressing that because of what's happened that people now, many millions, will be losing their jobs. And when there's a high unemployment rate, wages go down even more.
Do you also have worries about big business, let's say, profiteering from the destruction of the environment?
Not so much. Only in terms of if they have hypocrisy with it. Like, that's my issue with it. You have these like big businesses going, oh, we must sacrifice this and we must cut meat out and we mustn't travel. And yet they're the ones who cause the environmental damage. That's what irritates me about them. And if they, the big bosses of those companies won't be the ones to suffer any green regulations that come in. They have no issue paying green taxes, but the struggling everyday person in this country is having issues paying huge green taxes. The once a year trip to Spain is not going to cause huge environmental damage. But your bigwigs who are flying around in their private jets and have huge factories in China are the ones that have caused it, but they won't financially suffer from it. That's what gets to me.
Do you agree with the common, let's say, left-wing and BBC view, which is very, very, it's almost like you can't watch television without being hammered with it every 10 minutes, that we're in a climate emergency that requires immediate deindustrialization? And the only way that we can do that is by creating popular support for a kind of a business revolution where business can no longer really give people industrial technology the way that it used to. Do you agree with that?
This is the hypocrisy at its finest. Basically, all this whole thing to destroy industry in the West comes from the UN. The UN, who I've written about many, many times, is inundated with Western-hating despots. Very anti-Semitic too. I've written many times on this. It will be the West that pays for this. This will head us into, and I've written about this recently as well, this will head us into a new feudal system. This is so regressive for the West. And at the same time, China, who says, oh, they'll sort this out in 2050, as if you can believe the Chinese Communist Party on anything, are building coal stations as we speak. The West, like the UK, there is so little carbon emissions that come from this country in comparison to the huge carbon emissions in countries like Indonesia and China. We're responsible for like 0.01% or something so low. Yet our entire lives here will be smashed to ribbons, smashed to nothing. People will suffer badly because all of a sudden the UN has decided, and they've been trying to do this, to punish the West and throw us back into a feudal system where people will have nothing because of the environmental policies that the Tories are planning to implement by 2030 as well, cheered on, of course, by Labour and the Greens. Mm-hmm. I'm very against this propaganda. It's very destructive to the West. There are other ways to deal with helping the environment, and it's not by destroying our Western civilization.
Do you think that green technology is sufficiently developed to replace fossil fuel technology, the way that so many environmentalists today sort of are writing articles about, let's say?
I think green technology is fantastic. I think anything that takes us off the reliance of fossil fuels is fantastic. My only issue with it needs to work for the majority and not the minority. It needs to be cheaper than fossil fuels. any green technology that means only that the elite can afford it and the rest can't is not good technology. It's not developed enough. If it can't be afforded by the majority to keep their living standards up, as we've had here in the West, then I'm not in favor. Why should people be put through this unnecessary suffering because you have megalomaniacs going around who have destroyed parts of the environment with the industry saying, okay, now you'll have to change your heating in your home and it will cost 4 times as much as you used to pay. What kind of a solution is that? It is unfair and it's wicked. And I'm very against implementing green technology unless it benefits the majority.
So what's interesting there is, although your views, one can see, are quite critical of left-wing orthodoxies, they're again quite nuanced. You're not the sort of conservative who says there is no problem with the environment and technology, or there is no problem with inequality, or there is no problem with big business. There's a lot of nuance in those views, despite them being passionately conservative.
Thank you, Greg. Well, I try, when I write, every sentence, sometimes it's a bit of a torturous experience for me, because every sentence I write, I always try to do a counter argument, thinking, okay, what do people, if I write something, is this making sense? What will people say to counteract it? What can I say in reply to an argument they might possibly give me? So I'm always trying to look at both sides of the argument before I finish a piece. And I also, because I've never belonged to a political party, because I don't define myself by a particular ideology, because I guess that does help in a way of being more nuanced. And I would say as well that my main thing, because I have witnessed so much suffering in my life, is to prevent people from suffering. And that's not said in like oh, I'm so fantastic, that's what I want to do. That is what motivates what I write about, to mitigate suffering, because there's so much suffering and I've seen so much of it. And that's what, and I don't like absolutism. I don't like to say, this is the way it is, and then not have any way to kind of maybe change my mind on something. It's very rare that I will change my mind on something, but I always want to know as much as I can from both sides of the argument before I decide on something.
The last thing I suppose I wanted to ask you about before we get into the actual pieces that we're going to be discussing is perhaps the preeminent part of today's left-wing and pop culture and corporate world political orthodoxy, and that is this idea that the West, or at least the English-speaking West of the UK and Canada and the US, that the West oppresses women and minorities. Do you think that claim is true?
Look, I think things have to be comparative. And also a very important point to make is that in the West, in the countries that you mentioned, there is legislation to prevent discrimination against minorities. And I don't like ideas of thinking us women as needing to be a protected class. It makes me feel like we're living in a Victorian era. We've come a long way in the West in terms of women's rights and feminism, but now it's kind of eating itself a bit. What happens, and I've seen this happen a lot, is that when you start, the West loves to navel gaze, it loves to look at everything that's wrong with itself, and that narrative is very much led by the left and progressive woke ideology. So the West likes to go, oh, we do this wrong, we do that wrong, etc. So all the focus goes on to how terribly racist the West is and how terribly sexist it is, etc., etc. And then because the narrative dominates everything, the people who are truly suffering from misogyny and from racism are ignored. And so it's a three-pronged thing. We have the legislation in place. We have tremendous progress in the West about racism and feminism. And we have the very sad fact that the more you focus on the West, where there is actually very little racism, very little misogyny, it's all kind of microaggressions, etc., then you're not focusing on where the real misogyny and hatred against women is, and you're not focusing on where the real racism in this world is. And those who are true victims of that continue to suffer. Now, and I think very much it's about a social norm. Like, if you're racist against somebody in this country, it's looked down upon, and rightly so. But the same thing if you are, if you're a misogynist, it really is not the dumb thing anymore. But it's how you define it. To call somebody that awful N word, which I will not use, that was used in South Africa a lot, for a person who is Black, is the most hideous, horrible thing. That's pure racism. But to kind of just like, as I just saw, I was reading an article about this poor lecturer at Truro University who's been banned from society and has to write an apology because she accused Meghan Markle of being a colourful personality. Now that is insane. That just shows how bad this kind of whole racism has become. The same thing with sexism. If you go for a job and you're pregnant as a woman and you're not allowed your job, they don't hire you because you're preggy, so they fire you because you're pregnant. That is sexism. That should not be allowed. But if you walk down the street and some boulder wolf whistles at you, that is not a microaggression. That is not a case for the police. I mean, it's like watching the West, and I've written on this many times and said many times, the West is committing suicide. And these are the ways that they're doing it.
Do you think maybe the problem with Western culture is it has expectations that are just way too high? So instead of saying we've gotten racism and sexism quite stigmatized, we've made official discrimination illegal, we've made it part of our social norms and etiquette not to be racist or sexist, that's not good enough, because even antisocial behavior, even the offhand rude remark, has to be completely eliminated for us to say that we live in a non-sexist, non-racist society. So the expectations are super, super high.
Well, I call those, and I've done this for a number of years, post-liberal Puritans, where everything has to be of purity. And everything, we see this with COVID. We have to have zero COVID. We see this with carbon emissions. We have to have zero carbon emissions. It's a zealotry which is akin to kind of like fundamentalist religions. And it's the same thing here. I don't think it's about higher standards. This is a self-hatred of the West that I've never seen before. I mean, it's, other than when I started living in the West. Like, I'll tell you something interesting. For a year and a half, William was working in Singapore, and there the Singaporeans had the most amazing pride in their country. The Singaporean flag is flown everywhere. I was there for National Day. It was the most astounding experience. You'd never get this in the UK. People have this innate, and particularly on the left, this weird innate hatred of their own country, thinking it's the most racist, sexist place in the world. And so I would say that it's not so much high standards, but a self-hatred, a perverse self-hatred inflamed by post-liberal Puritans, for whatever end that is, whether it's to destroy society, to create their socialist utopia, whether it is because there are hucksters and want to get lots of money for their various charities they're running against racism, etc. Whatever the motivation is, I don't trust them at all. They are anti-West and hate their own country, and It's not about high standards to me. It's about sheer, insane hatred of their own place, of their own country, of the West.
And what would you say to somebody who objects to patriotism, let's say? And there are people all over the political spectrum. There are libertarians who don't like patriotism either. It's not just left wing people.
Um,
But what would you say to
I,
people who say that patriotism leads to war, leads to the demonization of outsiders, leads to a country being too uncritical of itself? What would you say to that?
I would say that there's a big difference between patriotism and nationalism, and that to be patriotic gives a person a sense of identity and anchors them, which is very important to the human condition. As humans, we've evolved. We always have had a sense of identity, of belonging. So ancient humans would have had a sense of belonging to their very small tribes group, their clans group. And then as a human society developed, it would be a sense of belonging to a wider community, that town, then a city. As countries formed, the same thing. You'd have your tribe, you'd have your community, then as humanity evolved, you have your different religions creates a sense of belonging, etc. Humans need a core central identity that they can all relate to make them feel safe, to make them feel that they belong to something. It's very human to do that. To take away a person's sense of core identity when it comes to the country that they're living in, that they feel patriotic in terms of feeling that they belong, and then there is a core identity to that country, is to take away this very human's need to belong. They need to feel safe and secure and to feel part of a wider community. Take that away and you have a society that is tearing itself apart. It's far worse than to take away a sense of patriotism than it is to have a sense of patriotism. Patriotism does not lead to nationalism. Singapore has never started a war with anyone, and Singapore has a huge high level of patriotism.
What's fascinating about your praise of Singapore, having lived there, is most Westerners that I speak to, whether they're left or right, think of Singapore as absolutely dreadful. I mean, I think William Gibson once described it as Disneyland with the death penalty. I think it's a horribly repressive society. Why do you not see it that way?
I lived there, and I lived there for 14 months, and I loved everything about it. Yes, there is a very strict law and order thing. But I tell you something very interesting. The block of flats that we were living in, next to us was a halfway home, for newly released prisoners for rehabilitation. And part of their job, they ran a little furniture moving firm, house moving firm, etc. Now, if you had that in the UK, etc., you'd be beset with problems, drug dealers, people, fights, etc. They were lovely. The most, there was no police around. They came and went as they wanted. I often spoke to them because I'd walk past them as I went there. Singapore, yes, it's a very strict way in terms of law and order. But my word, the government there puts their own citizens first. For example, I went to the zoo once, and there's a sliding scale of payments, which people in the West would probably be a bit horrified of, but I understood it. You as Singaporean, you paid, let's say, $10. If you had permanent residence as an expat, you paid $12. But if you were just, working there or living or just, there as a visitor, you paid $15. So there are perks to being citizens. They're very careful with who they let into the country. While I was there, there were about four workers from Bangladesh who were found guilty of Islamist terrorism, real terrorism. They were expelled literally a few days later from the country. The Singapore government takes care of its own. I really admire that. Do you know that the Singaporeans are the ones who own most of the expat housing in the UK? They're the ones who invest the most in buying homes in the UK. The reason being there's a very low tax regime, and about 90% of them live in government houses, which are government flats, etc., which are very nice. It's an incredible society because the government take care of its own first. I loved it. And I loved the Singaporeans. They were amazing, amazing human beings. I miss it every day of my life.
Did you feel there that you had basic freedoms like freedom of speech, for instance?
Well, I didn't get really involved in politics in Singapore. I was more, because I wasn't there permanently. I think there is less freedom of speech in Singapore, but because most Singaporeans tend to have this wonderful life there doesn't seem to be so much infighting and issues. I mean, this was just my impression of living in Singapore for 14 months, that there is a very yes, this is quite a structured society. It's not without its issues of racism. There's a lot of racism projected to the Indian community, etc. But what was interesting is that when Singapore kind of got independence from Malaysia and there were race riots, I think it was in the 60s, the government then decided that everybody who lived in government housing blocks, there would be a mix of Chinese, Malay, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, so that everybody lives together. There are no ghettos. And that creates that society, that cohesion. And I never felt, it was interesting. As a Jew, it was the only place I felt safe to be Jewish other than Israel. Yeah, there's a big connection between Singapore and Israel.
Now, the both of us, interestingly, we're both expatriates in a sense. I'm a British citizen, but I grew up in Los Angeles and I have a Los Angeles accent. You grew up in South Africa, but you're also in the UK with me right now.
Yes.
So I'm curious, do you feel patriotic about this country that we're both living in right now?
I feel very patriotic about this country. It's been my home for 21 years, other than the bits of time I lived in Singapore and Canada. I'm a British citizen. My husband is British. I came here to make a life for myself, and it's my only home. And I guess I fight very hard for what I see are the good things in this country because it is my home. I'm very patriotic.
What do you love most about this country that differentiates it from a lot of the other countries you've lived in?
It's quite a difficult question to answer because what I have loved about this country has changed so much in the last year. So I will answer it like this. Pre-2020, I love the freedom here. Do you know, when I emigrated here, and I was in Chester for a year and a half, and then I moved to London, and I loved the freedom I had there. I was in my early 30s, and with South Africa, you can't go anywhere without a car and everything's dangerous. In London, I could go out to the centre of town till 3 a.m, catch the night bus home. Maybe you can't do that now. I'm talking about 20 odd years ago. But it was the freedom I had to just do and travel where I wanted. I loved the freedom. I loved the kindness of the British people. They're very kind people here. Like, when I first moved here, my father was working here and he rented a house up north, and I'd been here there a couple of weeks, and I'm very clumsy, and I managed to, in one day, hang out washing and break the washing line with my terrible clumsiness, and all the clean washing went down to the floor, and I didn't know what to do. My father was at work, and so I went to knock next door to the neighbor I hadn't met, and she was so lovely. So sweet. She came, got all my washing, got a friend's husband to fix the line for me. She didn't know me. She just met me that minute, did all my washing, cleaned it, ironed it for me. And that's when I realized that the Brits are an incredibly kind people. I love the kindness here. I used to love the freedom until the Tories took that away. The freedom here, I love that this country is literally like the center of the world. So much has emanated, so much good has come from this country to the rest of the world. People don't realize. I love the fact that you can criticize politicians, as I do, without being garbed and thrown into jail, as people would have been in South Africa. There was so much freedom, and there's so much kindness, and those are the things that I love.
Yeah. No, when you meet a British person who isn't kind, it's quite shocking.
Yes, because when they are unkind, it is shocking.
Whereas it's not shocking when you meet an American that's not
I mean, it's just like the kindness here. I've always been just blown away by, and I also like very much the non-materialism of this country. In South Africa, it's what car you drive and, you know, how many homes you have and what job you do. Here, most people don't care. They don't want to know what car you drive. They don't want to know how much you earn a year. They just want to know that you're a good person, and I like that.
Yeah, there's something about England and Wales and Ireland, those places in particular, I've noticed, where despite the fact that they have prosperity, they tend to avoid the materialism that you're more likely to see in the US.
Yes, and South Africa.
And I wonder why that is. I wonder if that's a cultural or a historical tendency. I wonder if it's because of World War II. I wonder where that comes from.
I think it's about a value system. And I think there are other values that people have here other than materialism. Yes, of course, people will be materialistic, etc. I also think, you know, the living standards in this country aren't high in comparison to, well, what South Africa was when I was growing up and to what America is. The living standards here are not that high. Homes are not as a good condition. An everyday home in England, you know, normal home, middle class home won't be as fancy and beautiful as a home in South Africa, or in America. You know, the living standards are lower, so people are not really that focused on if you have the newest design for your bathroom. I think because a lot of people also financially struggle in this country for the reasons that we've spoken about. So nobody wants to make, as part of the kindness of the British, they don't want to make somebody feel bad just because they can't afford the newest car. So I think it comes from kindness and a value system, which I like very much.
Yeah, me too. That's one of the reasons why, when I first came here 15 years ago, I decided to stay and I worked very hard to become a citizen,
Yeah.
and paid a lot of
Takes
money
a lot
for
of
that.
work. Yeah, takes a lot of work to be a citizen.
No, they really make you work here to become a citizen.
Oh, they really do.
But, I can, in a weird way, see that as part of the British character as well. Because they really believe that you should put in hard work for
Yeah.
other people.
Yes. Yeah, I really like, there's a lot of, this is what drives me mad about the left, particularly, how much they hate their own country and their own people. There is so much goodness in this country. There's so many good people. I mean, I'll talk about this more with the death piece when we talk about it, but when my sister and father were dying, the neighbors who lived next door to my parents they were angels of mercy. I barely knew my parents. Angels of mercy. And just, I'm astounded every day by the kindness that I see with British people. And yes, getting my British citizenship was hard work and it's tough and they don't make it easy. But my word, it was worth it.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a bit about some of the pieces that you've been writing as a person in this country. One of the pieces I want to talk about that you've written in October of 2019 is an op-ed that you wrote called "Police Must Be Crime Fighters, Not Social Justice Warriors."
Yes.
And this was for the Conservative Woman, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Now, this is a really fascinating look at some of what's been going on with the police in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at some things that are going on with the way the police are handling transgender activism, the way they're handling environmentalism, some corruption within the police where people are being accused of being pedophiles and so on. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from this piece, which is quite beautifully written and interesting, and we'll go into what it means and how you want to maybe explain it. But the excerpt I want to read goes like this, quote, "At the recent Labour conference, a feminist group called Women's Place UK tried to hold a meeting to discuss the legitimate concerns that transgender activism is harming women's rights and safety. Sussex police illustrated my point as they stood by and did nothing while Labour transgender activists banged on the windows of the meeting room, threatened the feminists, and threw liquid at their faces. Given the plethora of acid attacks, this must have been terrifying for them. One could be forgiven for thinking that Britain has now regressed into a westernized version of Iran, where women are imprisoned and brutalized by police for wanting freedom and equality. Seemingly, Sussex police didn't want to upset transgender activists for fear of being called transphobic. Their craven excuse for such impotent policing was that they tried to balance everyone's rights. But policing is not about kowtowing to narcissists who insist that their trendy identity obsession takes precedence over protecting women from violence, unquote. Now, that is definitely controversial.
I know. But I couldn't write it in any other way.
So, I want to ask you some questions about that. One of the things that it sounds like you were definitely not impressed by was the statement by the police that they were trying to balance everyone's rights in policing activism. Do you think that the police shouldn't be trying to balance rights when it polices activists who make some sort of social transgression, whether it's breaking the law or intimidating people or something like that?
Well, the thing is, they say they're trying to balance people's rights, but to be quite frank, they certainly didn't balance women's rights, as these activists terrified those women, and the police did nothing about it. You can't say that you're trying to balance everyone's rights by letting men or other women be violent towards another group of women. I mean, you can't say that. You can't claim to do that and then stand by when violence is visited upon a bunch of women who are just trying to discuss their rights and to hold a meeting about legitimate concerns. The police are, I call them agents of the state now. They are so far away from the remit that they should be doing that they are terrible, absolutely terrible. So, this whole idea that, we've got to be fair to this group and we've got to be fair to that group actually ends up where you're actually just fair to one group and let violence be visited upon another group. And that's what happened there. This is what happens when the police think that they are trying to be virtual signaling social justice warriors instead of actually protecting women from being threatened with violence and having liquid thrown at them. That made me very angry.
Okay. What would you say to the argument that the trans activists felt frightened by the women's rights campaigners?
How could they have felt frightened when they're holding a meeting to talk? This is what I'm talking about, this whole idea of microaggressions. Words are not, unless you say to somebody, I hate you, I'm going to kill you right now with my axe. Words should not ever be seen as violent as punching somebody with a fist. The fact that they are seen as violent means that we're in this terrible mess that we are in, where women who are trying to discuss legitimate concerns about men going into women's bathrooms or men going into women's prisons. I wrote about this as well, that rapists are being allowed into women's prisons if they call themselves transgender. This is just, it's just astounding that women are being subjected to that. If Women's Place UK had attacked these transgender activists and come out punching them, etc., then I'd be the first to say, oh no, the police of course had to stop this. But having a meeting to discuss concerns should not be a threat to anyone.
Okay, well, there is a common mainstream view at the moment, which is everywhere, which basically says that you are the gender that you say you are, or even the sex you say you are. And if anyone says you're not, even if it's to themselves or in a group where they're not addressing you specifically, that's a threat to your life because it might encourage other people to beat you up or it might make you want to kill yourself. So it's as much a threat to a transgender person's life to say you're not who you say you are as it is to punch female activists for women's rights. Would you disagree with that?
I would say the following with this, that this whole, things become a fashion, things become a trend. Now, I think unless you are 18 years old and above, you should not be making any decisions about what gender you want to be. I think there's a big mistake on saying that there are many different types of gender. I think you are, unless you go through a complete transition and really, become a man or a woman, etc., with hormones and operations, etc., then yes, then you have become transgendered, and I have no issue with that. What I do have an issue with is somebody a man putting on some lipstick and a dress and calling himself a woman. I have a huge issue with that. I also have an issue with children as young as 5 or 6 being told that they could be, that they're stuck in a boy's body if they're a girl, or they're stuck in a girl's body if they're a boy, and they must start taking hormone medications straight away to change their sex, so to speak. That's, to me, is child abuse. I also have a huge issue with the fact that, as I come back to the point about the West navel gazing, yes, there have been awful incidents where transgender people have been subjected to attacks, and that is wrong and that shouldn't happen. But the point of the matter is those are minimal compared to the threat that women face in their own public toilets or in their own prisons, where men can put a dress on, put lipstick on and say, I'm a woman, and go in and attack a woman. That is what I have an issue with. I also have an issue with this whole transgender thing in terms of becoming part of identity politics, a part of the weird things that I've seen by, universities saying that, if you don't have sex with me, then you are, a transphobic. I mean, weird, awful things creating a sense of an identity victimhood that really does not necessarily need to be there, and takes away again the focus on real victims everywhere, even in this country too. I just think it is something that has a lot more focus on it than it should be. And the reason being is because the West navel gazes, and it's another way for the left to control the narrative in the mainstream media to bash the West. Aren't you all terrible transphobes? And that's what it comes down to.
You can change your gender.
This is me. This is my identity. You must accept me. If you don't, you will suffer.
Okay, what would you say to a medical doctor who says this? Okay, in the 50s and 60s, we started practicing transgender operations and giving people hormone therapy because if we didn't do that, they said they would kill themselves. Today, we refer to people as the gender pronouns they want. We let them go into the sex spaces they want because if we don't, they will kill themselves. So if we're trying to prevent people from killing themselves, why shouldn't we capitulate to transgender activism? Because it's all about, and always has been about, preventing people from killing themselves.
I don't think it's about preventing people from killing themselves. People kill themselves for many reasons. And I think if you are going to kill yourself because you think you were born in the wrong body, then I think you need therapy, as we all need therapy for various reasons. We all need therapy for things. And if therapy doesn't work, and I think, I think a lot of the times, and I think studies have shown this, that people go into kind of want to change their sex, because that's what it really is, changing from male to female, female to male, because there are other issues in their life and they think this is what will solve it. So I think very much it's a bit of a absolutism, a bit of a unnuanced way to say, if you don't let somebody do that, then they will kill themselves. If somebody wants to kill themselves, chances are it's not just because they think they are in the wrong body. I think as well that there are cases where people really are traumatized by being in the wrong body and absolutely should get every bit of help that they need. But I think there's a big difference between when that happens and where it's just become a fashion, as we see at school, where now it's a big fashion for people to do that. It's a trend. And I think you have to distinguish between those who are truly, truly feeling like that and the rest who go, okay, well, he's doing it, so I want to do it too. And if I don't, I will kill myself. You have to distinguish between the two.
Now,
again,
go on.
I was just going to say, it takes away the focus. If you're trying to help 20 young people who say, I'm in the wrong body, I want to be a woman, and only 2 of them really are feeling like that, but the other 18 are just going along with the trend, who do you help? Do you help the 2 that really would kill themselves, God forbid? Or do you have to kind of spread out all the resources and just help all 18 others with very little resources, because there's not enough resources to go around? So, the real victims, the ones who really are suffering, get overlooked.
So,
or risk getting overlooked.
I suppose the difficulty there is, how do you tell the difference between the real transgender people?
That is what psychologists need to do and doctors need to do. This is why I think for somebody who's really suffering, if it's a good doctor, they will pick up on it. They will know. But I think to be quite frank, if you went to a doctor and said, I want to change my gender, etc., or I'm going to kill myself, any doctor would want to make sure that you don't kill yourself. And they would need to look that it's not just the fact that you want a transgender that's making you feel depressed. I'm not a medical doctor, but I would think that any good doctor would need to look at what's going on with that person and see if that's really the reason. If it's really the reason, then absolutely change your sex. But do not tell me that you can put a dress on and a lipstick and call yourself a woman with all the male genitalia attached, because then you are not.
So you don't think that the medical practice of transgenderism itself is a mistake that led us to where we are?
At all. No, I don't think that at all. I think if somebody really, and there are people who do feel like that, if they are really feeling that they're in the wrong body and want to change sex, then absolutely they should get the help to do that. Where I have an issue with it is men putting on a dress who have violent misogynistic tendencies towards women, like rapists, and those awful people who attacked Women's Place UK, when they had the meeting. So, if you really, to be quite frank, that's what I have the issue with. That's my issue. You cannot call yourself a woman by putting on a dress and putting lipstick on, and then you go and attack other women who feel threatened by this. The other issue is the disappearance of women's spaces because of this. Mm-hmm. Calling a woman, taking away this whole idea that you can't say a woman is pregnant, you have to say a person is pregnant. I'm sorry, stop cancelling out what makes us women. That's what I have an issue with.
Okay. Do you believe that trans people have rights that include other people having to accept their gender identity?
To be quite frank, I always accept somebody's identity. Identity is not just one thing. Identity is made out of a myriad different things. What I have an issue with is that if you take on an identity and then use it to create havoc and divisiveness, and your identity basically oppresses another person's identity, really. And that's, a lot of the transgender activists are actually oppressing women with their transgender rights. And that's the issue I have with it. I have no issue if somebody, we moved from one place in Canada to another, there was a moving company that I employed, and it was made up of young students. They were fabulous. And 2 were transgender, and they called themselves they. I had no issue with that. Why would I want to hurt somebody and say to them straight away, oh, no, I'm not calling you that. If you're a boy, I'm going to call you a boy. They said, my name is so-and-so, and can you call me by they? Why would I, I'm not going to start an argument with that. But what I will have an issue is that if they visit violence upon women and take away women's spaces and women's identity and women's rights, just so that they can call themselves whatever they want, that's the issue.
Are you okay, for instance, with female to male transgender people going into male bathrooms?
I think so, mainly because there's been so many documented cases, and that men, are going into female bathrooms, pretending to be transgender to do these things. That's the issue that I have. I think a lot of the time women going into a transgender man, I don't have an issue with that. I have an issue with men visiting violence on women and using their transgenderism as an excuse. That's my issue.
So interestingly, it sounds like what you're saying is it's not actually transgender women that are going into the female bathrooms. It's cisgender men who are pretending to be transgender women who are going into the female bathrooms.
And there's a lot of it. And if you have, I wrote this piece a while ago, but I would wonder how many of those men attacking that Women's Place UK meeting are truly transgender or masquerading as a woman because they hate women and using it as an excuse to attack women. I think there's quite a lot of it. That's what I'm against.
The other bit of the police misconduct that this piece goes into directly afterwards, which is interesting, is about the case of Harvey Procter. So there's a passage from this piece which reads, quote, "British police are now in the habit of perpetual wrongdoing, followed by insipid apologies. But apologies are not enough for men like Harvey Procter, whose reputation was ruined by dishonorable police officers who apparently couldn't wait to get a Tory bigwig behind bars, so much so that they misled a court when obtaining search warrants for Procter's home. In other words, they lied to get their man, and this means no one is safe from politicized policing," unquote. Now this is really controversial, because this paragraph sort of suggests to me that you think that the police are out to get Tories. Or is that a bad reading of it?
No, it's exactly what I was suggesting. The police are very politicized, and it's got even worse since then. I mean, we only have to see what happened with the Black Lives Matter protests last year, where, I mean, I've written a lot about Black Lives Matter in terms of the movement, not the ideology, not the sentiment, but in terms of the movement, who it's run by. It's run by Marxist Jew haters who are virulently anti-Semitic. There were pogroms against Los Angeles Jews last year with the Black Lives Matter protests during that time. And in the UK, you had police bending the knee to these to Black Lives Matter protesters, who were being very violent, and who a lot of them are very anti-Israel, very anti-Semitic. It turned my stomach to see the police do that. And that's my point. Like, you know, they had no issue doing that, but they've been brutal with anybody who's protested about lockdowns over this last year. The police are extremely politicized. They are not policing properly. I mean, this whole thing is that they now focus mainly on hate crimes and hate speech. I hate those two words, those two phrases, because, it's all about controlling what you have to say and what you do. And the police are agents of the state, making sure you don't say or do anything that the state disagrees with. And very much, I mean, the police, a lot of the the officers, I don't blame the everyday policemen that you see about, I blame the officers in charge are very much on the left. So they will do everything they can, to me it seems that if it's a Tory, etc., they will go for the jugular. Or if it's somebody that is a soldier, anything that the left hates, they will go for it. It's very politicized.
Okay, so what would you say to the objection that's often given, let's say about Black Lives Matter, that most people on Black Lives Matter are ordinary people who don't hold radical views. They just want to show solidarity with people who have a problem with what they think of as a ubiquitous social, structural oppression of Black people by the police. And because the majority of them are peaceful, we should see this as a peaceful movement of largely normal, non-radical people, and we shouldn't see the radicals as representative of the movement. What would you say to that?
Several things. One, the movement itself is led by radicals who want to see the downfall of Western civilization. I've written a few times about it. They've been trained by Marxists in Cuba, etc. There are Marxists who are, hate democracy, hate their own country. They're also financed, parts of the offshoots of Black Lives Matter movement is financed by the Chinese Communist Party. I've written about this as well. This is not a good movement. If you're going to take part in a movement that is run by leaders like that, no matter what your intentions are, even if your intentions are peaceful and to raise awareness, you are doing the dirty work of Marxists and communists and authoritarianism regimes like the CCP who want to see the downfall of the West. So I'd say, be careful of who you go marching and protesting for, because unless you have the real information, unless you are clued up to what these people are, you're shilling for them. You are they're foot soldiers. You are, as Stalin called, they're useful idiots. And again, I come back to the same point. Yes, I mean, the UK is different when it comes to the police. I have no doubt, yes, of course, there is racism. But, and it's not as, you know, and in the US, we know that documented cases of racism by the police against people. But my word, the amount of racism in the US and the UK compared to what goes on in the rest of the world is minuscule, particularly because it is legislated that it's against the law to be racist. I mean, I wish people would open their eyes and stop navel gazing and have a look at what's going on in the rest of the world and help the real victims of suffering of racism. I think with the police taking the knee, bending the knee to Marxist oppression was one of the, I mean, it's extraordinary to witness.
So what is it about the police taking the knee that you particularly take issue with?
It's a capitulation to anti-Semitic Marxists. That's what it is. Everything's symbolic. So if you take the knee, you're signifying that you are supporting the movement, not just the sentiment Black Lives Matter. That's, I think anybody who doesn't think Black Lives Matter needs to really take a long, good hard look in the mirror. Obviously the Black Lives Matter, you know, but I'm talking about the movement as opposed to the sentiment. But when, you know, taking the knee is a signifier that you are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And if you have a look at what the Black Lives Matter movement stands for, then any police who did that really should be fired. I mean, it turned my stomach. Black Lives Matter, the movement, not the sentiment, are virulently anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-West, and are financed by nefarious organizations, including the CCP.
Okay.
And the leaders are trained Marxists. And that is, it's all evidence. This is stuff you find in the mainstream media. This is stuff you find on Black Lives Matter website. It's not stuff I'm making up.
So would you, in a parallel way, say that if, for instance, the anti-lockdown protests were primarily run by far-right groups who were organizing them at the top level, that would make people who are criticizing lockdown have good reasons not to join these protests as well?
Well, I would say that a lot of the protests are not run by the far right. I mean, it's very odd to me that this whole thing of freedom and civil liberties is suddenly a far right thing. I mean, it's totally bizarre. I personally, the one that was initially run by David Icke and Piers Corbyn, of two people that I really don't like, I would have nothing to do with. But the other lockdown protests have been run by ordinary, everyday people who are not in any way far right. It's quite extraordinary that, to me, that they've been smeared as far right by the Tory government, which speaks volumes to me.
So going back to this country, the Tory government and the police, what would you say to someone who is a bit surprised at the idea that you think that the police is so left-wing, given that the Tories are in power?
The Tories are not conservative.
Why do you think that?
The Tories are left-wing by their policies, by their capitulation to woke ideology. Have a look at Boris Johnson's New Green Deal. I wrote about that for Conservative Women. They're totally capitulated to woke ideology. Their spending is out of control. They are not, I call them Labour-like greenies, and they are not conservative in any way at all. So anything directions that come from that, particularly the way that the police have acted during lockdown on instruction from the Tory government, that is not a conservative government. That is a fascist, socialist, controlling, socialism and fascism are very similar, as we know. This is not a right-wing government. This is a fascist far-left government, and the police are acting as agents of the states, as they did in East Germany or Russia. And then you have a bit of police state stuff thrown in, as I witnessed with apartheid South Africa, and I see the similarities here. A conservative government would not be acting like this. The Tories are not conservatives.
Okay, so let's go back a bit to Harvey Procter. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what happened there, and why do you think that was an example of politicized policing?
Yeah, I remember. Basically, the testimony against Harvey Procter was done by a Carl Beach, who made the false allegations. And I think just reminding myself of it, is that they believed his claims to be credible and true. Yes, so apparently the warrants were obtained unlawfully. The High Court judge said that that's what happened. There were warrants to go into Harvey Proctor's home and arrest him and search his home, and that was obtained unlawfully, and the searches should not have taken place. Yeah, there were a number of factors that undermined the case of warrants being issued, but they still were. Yeah, there were gaps and shortcomings in the police investigation. And basically, this fantasist, Carl Beach, reported to the police, made allegations about Harvey Proctor, and the police acted on it with no proof. And I think very much that it was about, he was a former Tory MP, and the police like to stick it to him, Tory MPs.
Let's explore that a bit. So why do you think in particular that this was a case of the police going after a Tory rather than just the police being overzealous with believing an accusation?
Because the police, the higher commands, is dominated by the left. And I think, to me, that is what it comes out in. And I've said this before in my writings, that the institutions in the UK are dominated by the left. Not the left of 20, 30 years ago, the left, which to me is so fascist. And the left dominates everything in this country, the mainstream media, our universities, our schools, the police, the judiciary, government. There's no sign of any conservatism in government anymore. The left dominates everything. And so I would imagine if something came up like this for the police, I can't obviously speak of the exact motivation, but the evidence shows me that given what I know about the left dominating the higher echelons of the police force, they would have seen, it's a right-wing conservative ex-MP, let's go for the jugular.
So what would you say to a lot of left-wing people that say, no, the higher echelons are dominated by the right because you've got rich Tories and big business, you've got all the newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Mail, which get more readership than The Guardian, and also you've got a Tory government, so obviously the police are going to be in bed with the Tories. What about that narrative do you think is wrong?
Well, I would say a lot of people who run big business in this country are not on the right, are not conservative. We go back to the same point that the Tory governments are not conservative. And we go back to this whole thing is that a readership does not, just because the Mail attracts a certain amount of readers does not mean that the Mail is dominating the narrative. If you have a look at the BBC and Sky News, their narrative is very similar to what the Guardian puts out. So, the BBC and the Sky News are perhaps the most watched or, of all the kind of broadcast media or the radio listened to by the BBC. So, and they will be coming from the left. So I would say it's slightly delusional to say that.
So this gets complicated. So you think the Tories are left-wing, but...
Oh, God, totally.
But the Tory police, which is also left-wing, has it in for the Tories.
Well, I would say this, Harvey Proctor was a former MP, not part of the way that the Tories are now.
Okay.
So, and I think that would have been a telling factor. I think that's what it would be. I wouldn't say that the police have it in for the entire Conservative Party as it is now. The police are now agents of the state, of the Conservative Party. I would say that the values of the police and the current Tory party align very well. But somebody like Harvey Proctor, when he was an MP, the values of the police as they are now, the values of the Conservative Party as they are now, wouldn't have aligned with the values of the Tory party when Harvey Proctor was an MP. And that's the difference.
This also gets complicated because some people think that the Conservative Party today is a bit more populist and a bit more democratic, a bit more open than it was, let's say, under Cameron. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's less of those things?
I think it's still the same. I mean, Cameron was hopeless, and May was as hopeless. I would say no. I don't think there's been much difference at all. I don't see a huge difference, other than even more of a shift to the left than it was under Cameron and May's governance.
Does it matter to you that Boris was a Brexiteer, whereas David Cameron was not?
Well, I thought Boris being a Brexiteer would have been in his favour, because I am a Brexiteer, but he's bungled that and, has wrecked this country. So it's a moot point. Whether or not he is a Brexiteer or not matters nothing at the moment, because we're not reaping the benefits of Brexit. Because one, we're not fully Brexited, if that makes sense, and two, he's destroyed this country, so we cannot take advantage of the benefits of a proper Brexit.
Do you see anything hopeful in the last two elections, the one a couple of days ago and the one in 2019, with the massive move towards the Tories, which seems largely to be motivated to some extent by a support for getting Brexit done and not wanting to have people who want to overturn Brexit in power and things like that?
I think the 2019 election, the hope with that was short-lived after March 2020. I don't see Brexit being a reason why the Tories won in Hartlepool. I see the reason why the Tories are doing well is because they are giving away all this free money. And also because Labour is so hopeless. Labour are literally a bunch of juvenile social justice warriors in Parliament. They offer nothing to nobody except those involved in divisive identity politics. So it's no wonder nobody wants to vote for them other than their own little echo chamber. What we have is the worst political party in power with an even worse political party as the opposition. So we have a terrible government in power with an even worse opposition party. So it's not so much about voting for what the Tories represent, but it's more about not voting for what Labour currently is, which is a divisive, navel-gazing echo chamber of juvenile social justice warriors.
Do you think that since Labour got rid of Corbyn and replaced him with Keir Starmer, that it's become a better party which can challenge some of those tendencies more that you described?
No. I wrote about this with Paul Hogan for Con Women a couple of times. Starmer is hopeless. His bending the knee to Black Lives Matter, his I promise I'll do something about the anti-Semitism. He's so weak-willed with that. It's not a better party. He's a terrible, terrible leader. He's called for more draconian lockdowns. He, as a Labour leader, should have looked out for the working class in this country, and by providing support for the working class, the ones who've been affected the most by the draconian, brutal lockdowns that the Tories have brought upon us. And a proper Labour leader would have said, would have protested about this, would have made sure that it didn't happen to our working class communities, rather than cheer them on and ask for even more draconian ones. Mm-hmm. He is hopeless. The only thing is that I haven't seen any evidence that he himself is anti-Semitic, but he's hopeless with dealing with the anti-Semites in Labour.
Okay, so speaking of protest, let's go back a bit to your piece, because you do write about environmental protest in a way which is quite interesting.
Yes, yeah.
You say, quote, just as when the police did nothing to prevent the protesters from shutting down Smithfield Market, sipping lattes while smug middle-class hooligans indulged their apocalyptic fantasies by preventing working-class butchers from making a living. Such a failure of duty at the top has created a politically correct averse force that is no longer fit for purpose, unquote. It seems like there are certain protests that you think are legitimate and other protests that are happening that you think are sort of a threat to society in a way, because they tend to cause the shutting down of shops, the cordoning off of streets, the feeling amongst ordinary people that there might be some kind of a violent mob that might erupt in violence anytime soon and so on. So I wanted to ask you, how do you, in your own mind, tell the difference between like a legitimate good protest versus an antisocial, dangerous, violent protest?
I think the issue I had with that is that you had middle-class trustafarians stopping working-class people from getting on the trains to go to their jobs so they can feed their kids. that's a major thing that I had, the major issue that I had with it. It's literally virtue signaling for no reason other than to say, look how marvelous and good I am, not caring that they were stopping working class people from going to their jobs to feed their own kids. I guess it's the hypocrisy that gets to me. That, only the police only allow certain people to protest and have to be very controlled with their protests, like lockdown protesters. And then you have letting other protesters have a free-for-all where they actually are interrupting and causing harm to other people's livelihoods. And that's the issue that I have with it. And also, I wonder with these protests, I can't remember if they were allowed to go, because I think in this country you have to apply for a protest and get permission to do that. And I think a number of protests that have gone ahead by these middle-class smug hooligans, as I call them, were not sanctioned and were, I suppose, as you could put, illegal, and yet the police tolerated them. It's the hypocrisy of it. That's what gets to me, as well as these trustafarians literally virtue signaling how great they are while disrupting everyday ordinary people from making a living. That's what gets to me.
Okay, what would you say to somebody who says that lockdown protests in a different way are hurting ordinary people by encouraging the spreading of an infectious disease?
Absolute rubbish. And, we've had several lockdowns. I mean, very interesting. Last year's Black Lives Matter protest, which attracted thousands of people in the cities. Did everybody drop dead of COVID after that? No. And not a word was said about super spreaders at those events. This lockdown protests, there have been several, have millions, thousands died from the lockdown protests? No. The whole idea of super spreaders, it drives me nuts. It's a way to shut down legitimate protests. And right now, given the grab on our civil liberties and our freedom in the name of a virus that 99% of people recover from and many people remain unaffected from, is beyond abhorrent to me. Absolutely. So I'd say anybody who says that really needs to get the facts.
Okay.
I want to make this clear. I never objected to the Black Lives Matter protest for the fact that they would spread COVID. I objected to it because of what they were standing for, anti-Semitic Marxists. That's what I objected to. As far as Extinction Rebellion, yes, if they want to go and protest, whatever, but don't disrupt working class people from making a living. That's what I object to.
What would you say to the argument that it's good that those working class people were disrupted because that disruption is for a greater good, which is saving the planet?
And I would say that it's condescending and patronizing, and what you're doing is destroying people's livelihoods for a cause that has been exaggerated and overblown for both financial and political means by those who control the narrative on climate change.
Yeah, you're talking about Extinction Rebellion. I was watching Greta Thunberg do a speech, and she looked at the camera and she seemed so angry at me. And she was...
Poor girl. I feel sorry for her.
And she was screaming and saying things like, "How dare you? You piece of shit, you're ruining my future. How dare you?" She seemed really mad at me.
The thing is, there are two things I wanted to say quickly about the point that you raised, that if people said, lockdown protests are being super spreaders and harming others. Lockdowns, as I've written about and I have mentioned, will cause and have caused and will cause so much more harm, death and suffering than COVID ever will. And that's the issue. So anybody who goes on a lockdown protest is actually preventing future suffering and preventing current suffering from getting worse. And I think as well, this is something that I'm just astounded by. We mentioned Greta Thunberg and we mentioned Brexit, etc. And one of the things that many people, who were on the Remain side and etc. and who are Greenies, etc., say that the future of children has been stolen. Brexiteers are stealing children's future. And I'm like, the one thing that is stealing our children's future is lockdown and the response to COVID-19, this insane draconian brutal authoritarian response rather than the civil liberties destruction of our economy. If anything's going to destroy your children's future, this is what destroys it. I mean, it's just, I'm astounded. I'm astounded by what I call extremist Remainers, because I know there are Remainers who are very against lockdowns too. So I call them extremist Remainers, who railed against the Tories for a long time about Brexit and this and that, and now obey everything that the Tories say without question. The other thing is that they railed against Brexit. Oh, it's going to close all the borders and it will stop my child from going to France for their gap year and blah, blah, etc., etc. And they're the ones advocating that all the borders must be shut because of COVID-19. I'm just astounded to witness this. Astounded.
Well, it seems like there are different social harms that different groups are willing to pay the price with to achieve different aims.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated in that way.
I mean, the thing is, like, you know, the piece I wrote for you on climate change, where I really do believe climate change is happening, but I think what is happening is that the causes of climate change, they're not defined properly yet. You know, I think people are attributing you to go on your once-a-year holiday to Spain and you've caused climate change. I think there are many reasons for climate change. I think you can't deny that it's happening, but I think what you have to look at are the reasons why. Who is at fault? China, I'm looking at you. And the solutions for it. Because, I mean, for example, one of the things that keeps astounding me again about this last year is many greenies kind of, you know, rail against the terrible destruction to our oceans and we've got to fix climate change because of the destruction to our oceans and et cetera, et cetera. Yet they say nothing about the millions of masks now being thrown into the oceans. That is doing far more environmental damage than your trip in your car to the local Sainsbury's. I mean, it's just lack of joined up thinking, and which makes me which drives home to me that this is not a real concern for the environment, but it's politicized, monetized opportunism. That's what I don't like about it.
What would you say to somebody who says, okay, you might be right about the protests going too far and preventing people from going to work, but in general, Extinction Rebellion is a good thing because it's a way for young people to stand up to the power of oil companies and rich corporations that have no interest whatsoever in being environmentally friendly, and they need to sort of be challenged by the public. And the Extinction Rebellion is a democratic way of doing that. How would you respond to that?
Several things. One, the Extinction Rebellion is dominated by Marxists, people who are anarchists. They've said it themselves. They wanted to destroy the UK. So I would say that nothing that comes from them is something positive. The other thing that I would say is that, I would say, you know, a lot of the big corporations are now very environmentally aware, and I think that's quite a good thing. And I would say protesting these corporations, these young people protesting the wrong bunch. You know, this is what has amazed me. Like, these people protest the wrong people. The harm that is coming to young people in this world is not from big corporations. That is not where the harm's coming. And to protest these big corporations in the West, who already do quite a bit, a lot for the environment anyway. They have a lot of environmental practices. They're protesting the wrong bunch, seriously.
Okay, what would you say to somebody who says that, disruptive protest in general is always a positive thing because so many things that we've inherited from the past, like women's rights, things about workers' rights, nuclear disarmament, came from disruptive protests. So we should always be kind and lenient towards disruptive protest because it has a track record of producing quite good things for society. What would you say to that?
I would say two things. Depends who you're protesting and what happens in the protest. As we come back to the XR protests that harmed people who are just trying to get on with their everyday jobs. And I would also say is that a lot of the protests now, other than the lockdowns, is navel gazing. You know, the things that people protest, you know, the environment. Why are you protesting it here in this country where people are environmentally aware? And there are legislation in place for zero carbon emissions, which I'm against. But anyway, it's there. Why aren't you, protesting China's coal stations? Why aren't you protesting Indonesia and the palm plantations there? Why is your focus always on the West, where there's very little harm that the West does and so much more harm in other places? Why are you navel gazing the whole time and putting all your energy in the wrong places? Stop, get your head out of the sand. Stop your hatred of the West. Stop doing the dirty work of the UN, which hates the West, and open your eyes, is what I'd say to them.
Okay. What would you say to the argument that climate change is an emergency? So because the West has the greatest power to do something about it, and we're the most advanced and the most civilized and the most environmentally aware, we have the greatest responsibility to clean up our act compared to the other countries. What would you say to that objection?
Several things. One, it's not an emergency. I'm old enough to remember being told, oh no, don't use your deodorant spray because the ozone layer is going to explode and then the sun will kill us all. I'm old enough to remember we were told that the earth will be flooded very soon and we'll all die from floods. I'm old enough to remember being told that, and it was when I came to this country first, that within 5 years, this was 1999 or something like that, 5 years, the UK is going to have a Mediterranean climate and will be growing olive oil, olive trees just like Italy. I mean, this is the thing. There's always some kind of climate alarmism, which it never comes true. So to me, I'm very suspect about it's an emergency. Because in my long life, I have seen that every climate emergency has never come to fruition. That does not mean I discount climate change. I come back to my original point that there is climate change, but the reasons as to why it's happening is another thing. But it is not an emergency. And the West, this whole idea that it's an emergency, this is fed by the UN, this whole Agenda 2030, and I think it's Agenda 21, and all of that is driven by the United Nations, which is dominated by Western-hating countries. And they, whether or not the West is technologically advanced when it comes to solving climate change, it doesn't matter. The point is that the UN it's a racket, it's a game for them to bleed the West dry of taxpayers' money and send it to various despots all over the rest of the world in the name of climate change. And our stupid, weak-willed Western governments go ahead with it. The only one who stood up to it was Trump. I come back to the things that I wrote about DFID and foreign aid. The motto, basically, I'm sure you've heard of the concept pay to slave, where DFID was financing, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Indirectly, they would use that money to pay terrorists who killed Jews and other Israelis. Israel's not just Jews, they were, who would kill Israelis and give them a monthly salary. It is a racket, a terrible, terrible system. And we see it on a broader level with the UN's climate change thing. It's such a racket. It's about taking money from the West, bankrupting the West, and giving it to the despots in all these other countries, as well as these very wealthy NGOs who pay very high salaries to their executives for what? To go and say, oh, well, stop building your coal stations, or let me pay for, we'll pay for this if you do that. It bleeds the West dry, and it's so wrong.
the UN has an ideology?
The UN's ideology, if you have a look at what they vote on, if you have a look at what mostly that they're about, if you have a look at dominates things like the UN Human Rights Council, like Iran and China. I mean, it's just their ideology is, to be quite frank, anything anti-West and anti-Israel. I mean, for example, like the World Health Organization, virulently anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Like every assembly they have, they do some Israel bashing. I mean, it's just, you have a look at, a good website to look at is UN Watch. And if you have a look at what the UN Human Rights Council do with most of their time, or the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN, they spend their time bashing Israel. Why should we take our lead on a group of what I call retrogrades, authoritarian, regressive regimes who are running and dominating the narrative on things like COVID and climate change and Israel? Why should we take the lead from those awful people who quite frankly hate the West and hate Israel and hate Jews?
What do you think of the argument that the reason the reason the United Nations exists is because in its absence we would have more geopolitical conflicts like what we saw in World War II?
The UN that was formed after the Second World War, it bears nothing to do with what the UN is now. The whole remit has changed. I think the UN is a very destructive organization, and I think there's no need for it anymore. We have globalization. We're much more connected now than we were 60, 70 years ago, where the UN was starting to be formed. Then it would have served its purpose as a focus, but now we're all connected. There's no need for an organization like that other than a tax-guzzling, despotic regime shielding organization. It really has become a way for dictators and despots and the world's worst regimes to hide what they do while lambasting the West. So how else can you account for the fact that Iran sits on the UN Human Rights Council, or China does? I mean, come on.
Okay. So would you say that the UN has a similar ideology to the ideology you see in the UK police at the moment?
No, I wouldn't say it does. I think you can't really compare that. I think it's not so much that the UN is dominated by left or right wing. I don't think it's about that. It's I would say, I can't really make that comparison. I wouldn't say the police are anti-West in any way. I would just say they're agents of the state, and the state right now, I have said before that what the Tories have done now is they've performed a coup against the people. This is a government performing a coup against the people, and the police are the agents of the state. But I can't really make that comparison between how the police are and the UN. Who knows? You just don't know what's going to happen. But I do know that many people are fed up with the police, are tired of the police not fighting real crime, of not responding to when they have real issues. And I think that's only been in the last few years. The police just been getting progressively worse and worse and worse because of this whole hate crime, hate speech, and then just focusing on things like that. I mean, it's very easy if you to accuse anyone of a hate crime or hate speech. You just go onto the police's True Vision website and just accuse anybody of a hate crime or hate speech, and the police are obliged to investigate that. Think of how many man hours are taken up investigating somebody who thinks, oh, I hate my ex-boyfriend, I'm going to accuse him of hate speech. I mean, and then you have real crimes, people's cars being stolen, people being attacked, there's huge knife crimes in cities like London, where children are dying from being stabbed to death in the middle of the street. Where are the police? Oh, somebody called me a nasty name on Twitter, so the police are dealing with that. And I think what you get is a very cynical, jaded population when it comes to how the police deal with things. Where it will take them, I don't know, but it can't be anywhere good.
And would you generally be against the idea of the public doing their own policing and doing vigilante justice instead of the police?
Oh, I'm very against it, because then you just have a breakdown in law and order. But if the police are not going to respond and the police don't protect you, what are you going to do? And that's the thing. This is, I think, where it takes us, I don't know. I mean, the whole thing of the last year and a half has just completely destroyed the fabric of the society. And I think it just has compounded the ordinary, everyday, law-abiding person's idea of what the police are there for. And the police are not there anymore to protect the law-abiding person against crime. They're there to enforce what the state decides, and they're there to enforce woke ideology. And you will be imprisoned if you are found guilty of racism, even if that takes the form of using a bad word. That is what we're up against. And people reach a boiling point. People reach a point where they've had enough. And I cannot see any good coming out the way that the police act. I cannot see any good coming out of how politicized the police are.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the degeneration of society, let's go from there to the next article I wanted to talk to you about. Why So Many Believe in the COVID Cult, that you published on October 23rd in 2020. I believe this one as well is also in the Conservative Women.
In the Conservative Women, and it made the top 10 of the most read blogs last year in Conservative Women, which made me very happy.
Well, when you actually get into the meat of what this article is about, this blog, it's understandable why it would wind up in the top 10. You start off by saying, quote, "Humans are sociable animals. We are not meant to be locked away in solitary confinement and denied the sight of each other's faces. To be forcibly separated from our loved ones damages our mental health. Masks dehumanize us and feed fear. Yet lockdowns, social isolations, and masks are the weapons of choice for politicians in their lunatic war on a virus, despite being detrimental to our health, economy, and society." Unquote. Now, again, this is very, very controversial because I suppose a lot of people would look at that paragraph and say, well, that's all true if we're not in a pandemic. If we're in a pandemic, all of that goes out the window. What would you say to those people?
Comes down to this whole thing about, there's several things I'd like to say about this. Number one, up until March last year, the UK pandemic plan was very similar, and you can have a look at it, it's online. 2011, the pandemic plan is very similar to what Sweden did. Protect the vulnerable and the elderly, restrict things to a certain degree, but make sure that society continues to function as normal as possible. Take the precautions that you normally would. For example, when we had the swine flu pandemic, I actually got swine flu. It was not nice at all.
So did I.
But did you as well? Oh,
yeah.
It was awful, wasn't it? But, I didn't even, it was just really unpleasant. But what I have to say is prior to 2020, lockdowns were never seen as a tool to deal with pandemics in the West or anywhere, basically. There are brutal medieval ways of dealing with a pandemic. All of a sudden, post-2020, they've become the go-to tool of dealing with a pandemic. And it is a sign of absolute insanity to me. I cannot believe that Western civilization and literally every other country in the world didn't take just precautions that were needed and put into plan a normal pandemic plan that many had written. I do say to people, have a look at the 2011 UK pandemic plan and other countries that have pandemic plans in action. It's very similar, their plans, to what the Great Barrington Declaration writes about. The two, it's very similar. Normal, conventional 21st century medicine on dealing with a pandemic. And along comes COVID-19 and everything changes. So I would say to people, have a look at what lockdowns really are and where it comes from. Lockdowns were always regarded as a terrible way to deal with a pandemic, not just only because they destroy society and the economy, but also because all they do is kick the can down the road. Sage, who I can't bear, said very similar last March, that we do the 3-week lockdown just to kind of save the NHS, take the pressure off the NHS, but we're literally, as Sage said, kicking the can down the road with the virus. So, they themselves said that. So And then all of a sudden, after 3 weeks, it becomes all about this is the only way to deal with the virus other than the vaccine. And not even the vaccine is good enough because, it might, not prevent transmission. So we'll have to keep lockdowning and we'll have to keep masks. And the whole world has gone demented and mad, other than a few outliers.
Okay, suppose by the end of the year, lockdown will largely be over, the economy will be back, and we'll find that actually a lot of the predictions about what lockdown was supposed to do to society weren't as bad as what we thought. If that happened, would you then say, maybe I was wrong, maybe lockdown actually worked?
No, because way too many people have suffered from lockdown, where there's been mental health issues, where there's been cancer patients denied their treatment. Do you remember the first few months of lockdown, dentists were closed? I mean, this is insane. You have the elderly shoved into care homes at the beginning of the pandemic by the callous NHS and government. That's where the majority of deaths have come from, as well as people going into hospital and dying from there. You've had people denied treatment, denied being seen their doctors because of non-COVID diseases. I mean, the suffering has been astronomical. You have people committing suicide because their businesses have suddenly gone. Self-employed people, their businesses have been obliterated. It's great if you have a huge house and lots of money and the government's paying you 80% salary, and that's fine. But it's not so great if you're living in the inner city in a horrible little flat and the government is only paying you 80% of your salary and literally your rent is half of that. I mean, people have suffered terribly, and it's not just in this country. I've written about South Africa, my homeland. People have suffered there beyond, the economy there's retracted 50%. People are starving. TB cases are rising horrifically. TB affects children. I mean, other than COVID doesn't really, but TB does. The UN, even though I hate them, have predicted a famine in the developing world because of this downturn in the economy and what's happening. People in Cambodia, I was reading about the other day, are starving in the streets because of lockdown. Even if there is no excuse ever, and I will never say, okay, I'm glad we did lockdown, because of the current suffering that people are being put through. Unnecessarily so.
Do you think if we never had a lockdown, society would get back to normal much quicker in the face of the COVID pandemic, or would it take much longer?
No, of course, if we'd never had lockdown, if we'd done what the 2011 pandemic plan was, take precautions, protect the elderly, protect the vulnerable, like Sweden did, restrict certain things, but make sure society function as normally as possible. We'll never get back to normal. It will take a generation. We now have people terrified of leaving their homes because they think they're going to die any second from COVID. We have children wearing masks in school, thinking this is a normal thing to do. We have a nation turned into a bunch of hypochondriacs. And I can say that, Greg, because I've been sick with ME for 14 years, deathly sick at times. I know more than most how destructive it is to a human being to think of themselves as sick all the time, which the government has encouraged people to do, as well as I know more than most what it's like to be isolated all the time from others, because I've spent many times on my own because I've been too sick to go out, and sometimes for months on end. It is a violence against the human soul. And do that, not just to one person like Emmy has done to me, but to millions. And you are creating a societal change that is going to take a generation to fix. It is a hideous, brutal, destructive thing, lockdown, and should never have been used.
Here's an interesting hypothetical question. Suppose we come out of lockdown by the end of the year. Things are kind of back to normal by the beginning of 2022. Let's say there's a new COVID variant that comes on the scene that suddenly skyrockets hospital beds, usages, and deaths from COVID once again. How do you think society should handle that, especially if that new variant causes panic?
The thing is, you do what Sweden did. We have the same death rate as Sweden, except Sweden didn't destroy their economy and crush society. You do exactly that, the same pandemic. And viruses have been around for as long as humans have been. We've always had pandemics, and God forbid there's a worse variant, then you deal with it with in terms of normal 21st century medicine that the Great Barrington Declaration writes about. You don't go back into medieval times and use a medieval instrument to tackle a virus. You just don't do that. I think as well that the whole thing about herd immunity, and I cannot believe that herd immunity in the 21st century has become a dirty word. The whole thing with herd immunity and is allowing the virus to weaken, which hasn't, but lockdowns mean you're just kicking the can down the road and the virus hasn't weakened. This is why we keep getting repetitive cases. You know, lockdown, I mean, it's the most stupid thing. The other thing that always amazes me about this whole lockdown, we know with COVID that the best way to ward it off is to be as fit and lean as possible. So what does the government do? It stops germs, it stops outside exercise, it makes you stay in your home where you get depressed and you eat and you watch Netflix all day. Most of us, I'm sure, put on weight during lockdown. You know, the ordinary everyday things of like running for the bus or etc., you don't do anymore. I mean, it's extraordinary. The same thing as well. We're locking down people into intergenerational households where you have elderly people catching COVID and dying from it because they're locked inside their homes with very little ventilation all day long. I mean, it's how not to deal with the pandemic, as well as the collateral damage of people's businesses. I'm astounded. You take away people's way to earn a living. You take away their livelihood. What's going to happen when the money is stopped by the Tory government? I'm astounded. It's horrifying to me.
So let's go back to this hypothetical example of the new variant in 2022 that's skyrocketing deaths and crowding the NHS hospital beds. Suppose in this situation, Boris Johnson says, sorry, we're not doing lockdown. It's just too costly to the economy. It's too costly to all sorts of things about society that we want to keep going. And the public is mad, paranoid, terrified, and there's all sorts of other problems because of the public's paranoia and terror at this new variant and feeling unprotected by the government. What do you think the government in that instance should do?
Well, they should have done what they did in March last year before they capitulated to the baying MSN and Labour who wanted draconian lockdowns. They should have said, no, the cost of human collateral and the economy is too high. Let me tell you something. Without a healthy economy, there is no health. Look at the developing world where they have low-income economies and terrible health services. You cannot have good health in a country with a devastated economy. There's just no way. And unfortunately, SAGE, etc., with their mind games have created a panic-stricken, fear-stricken society that shake in their shoes at the mention of COVID and think they're all going to die at any second. It's a wicked, evil thing to do to others, to have made people feel like that, all for a virus with a low mortality rate. And I mean, as far as NHS is concerned, like, we must be the only health service in the world where you're supposed to die in order to save it. I mean, how many people have died from untreated cancers now and in the future, or in order to save the NHS? It is heinous, wicked, evil to me.
Mm-hmm. So you would say that even in a case where the majority of the people want lockdown, the government should stand firm against the people and say no.
The government is elected to do what is best for this country. And all they have done is do what is worst for this country. You elect a government, not based, they should do what is best for the country. And unfortunately, these people have been turned into terrified children. They've been infantilized by this government, thinking the government will have to do everything for them. They're being made into terrorized little children. And it's going to take a generation to sort it out. If you had a government that was a real government, that wasn't just a bunch of clueless people with no idea what it's like in the real world. If you had a real government who put country before party and said, no, this will destroy the country. Yes, there'll be some awful scenes, and yes, the NHS will be overrun for a while, and yes, people will die. But the damage and deaths caused by lockdown will far outweigh anything that this pandemic will bring.
So would you be in favor of the government saying to people, in the presence of this new variant, which you're scared of, you still have to go to work? Sorry.
I would say, if you have a look at the 2011 pandemic plan, it's very much keeping things as normal. If you get sick, you stay at home. And employers need to make sure that they pay their employees who get sick, but it's to keep things as normal as possible. There have been far worse pandemics to hit the UK than this, and people went about their business and did what they needed to do. This has been a wholesale destruction of our economy and our society for a pandemic, which is, yes, a nasty strain and awful for those who are vulnerable to it, but it is not devastating. It's like, I read someone on Twitter, and I thought this is very interesting. It's like burning down your house to cure some mold in your basement. This is what's happened. And if the worst strain comes, we should never go on to lockdown, because lockdown doesn't do anything. It just kicks the can down the road. That's all it does. You use the 2011 pandemic plan that most countries had before they capitulated to the CCP propaganda on lockdown. You hold your nerve and you don't destroy millions and millions of people's lives, livelihoods, and their actual lives just to save a few. You can't do that.
So it sounds like you're coming at this from an ethical perspective. So in a way, It sounds like you think public opinion about this isn't so important.
No. And I mean, I don't trust things like YouGov. It's run by, hells of government ministers. I mean, what I don't trust, and I'll tell you why, not only just because of who it's run by, is because people have been terrorized into submission. They have been told this is the worst disease ever. I've had people say to me, oh, it jumps from fleas from one cat to another and then you'll die. I mean, that's what the Black Death did. This is not the Black Death. This is not Spanish flu, which killed children. This is a nasty flu virus, which is a pandemic, absolutely. But it is, if you're under the age of below 50 and in reasonable good health, do you know how many people have died who have been in reasonable good health under the age of, I think it's 50 since it started? About 400. Far more die every day from untreated cancers. I mean, this is what I'm saying. There's no perspective. It's quite, don't quote me exactly on the numbers. I can't even remember the exact number, but it's a ballpark figure that I'm giving. This is not an illness that's making children die. This is an illness that affects the elderly, and the government has killed the elderly. They put them into care homes at the beginning of the pandemic, where they all caught it and died. And then the loneliness that elderly people have, it's a killer for them as well. And some are so scared now from the mind games that stage have played that they won't even go to the doctor. And cancer treatments are going unmissed, etc., because of that. It's heinous, absolutely cruel and heinous.
What do you think the NHS should do in the event that we have another nasty variant that takes up a lot of space?
There were only a couple of hospitals in London at the start of the pandemic that was starting to look like what we saw in Italy. Now, the reason why Italy was so badly hit is because Italy is in hoc to the CCP Belt and Road initiative. There was a lot of a lot of traveling from China to Italy, etc. So COVID-19 was hit there very hard. There's an elderly population. The health service became overrun. We saw terrible images, etc. The same thing here in London. There were a few hospitals looking like they were about to turn into Italy, etc. And Neil Ferguson gave the worst ballpark figure of, I can't remember, 50,000 dead by Easter, or whatever it was. It was the worst scenario. Now, I don't totally blame him. I blame the mainstream media who don't understand statistics and figures, and so they exaggerated everything. 50,000 dead by Easter, we don't lock down now. And this was I often blame Sage, but actually they gave the worst case scenario, what would happen if you didn't do anything. Well, the UK pandemic plan before March 2020 wasn't about doing nothing. It had action plans that were like 21st century compassionate, first do no harm things, unlike lockdown. So the hospitals were never really, as that got to that stage of being incredibly overrun. Yes, perhaps in places like London and the city centres you had that, but we've had flu seasons before in this country where we've had worse scenes of people dying in hospital trolleys in flu season, and we never had lockdowns from that. I'll tell you something interesting. I had to last year had a couple of health things that I needed to go to A&E for, and also to various scans, etc. Some in Wales and some here where I live now. And the hospitals I went to throughout that year were deserted. There was no trolleys piled out high in front of the A&E, people dying of COVID. The first time I went to A&E, a local hospital I had to go to, but something that happened to me in late April last year, there was literally 2 people in A&E. This is why I don't trust what the government says.
Mm-hmm. No, we've had similar experiences like that too.
And I'm not saying that there weren't hospitals overrun. Absolutely. We know in London, etc., there were hospitals overrun, but that happens with every bad flu season. This is what I'm saying. It's been a complete overreaction to you and I having both had swine flu. We certainly wouldn't want to go off and get COVID. No, nobody in their right mind would want that. But the degree of the death rate, the mortality rate with COVID, and how many people it affects badly does not match the response of total destruction of our society and economy. That's what I'm saying.
So in this article you say, quote, masks act as filters, not barriers. Surgical masks are useful when visiting a hospital or a vulnerable person as long as they're worn and disposed of appropriately. But fabric and cheap paper masks worn in other circumstances are hazardous, aiding the transmission of the virus. Masks also weaken children's immune systems, setting them up for health issues later in life. To see a child in a mask is to witness a form of child abuse, unquote.
Why should children be put into masks other than to protect adults? There's something very, very wrong if a society allows children to be abused like this in order to protect adults or to make adults feel safe. It's distorted and disturbing, and it's warped. I mean, basically, if you are in a hospital setting or in a care home, etc., of course, yes, masks are needed to be used. Absolutely. I wouldn't want to see a surgeon but to do surgery on me without a mask. But those kind of surgical masks are used properly and disposed of properly. How many times you go into the town centre, people are, kind of their mask is dangling from one ear under their jaw while they, sip their coffee. Those cloth masks are awful. I don't know how people breathe in them. I mean, the masks are not worn properly. How many people can afford to buy paper masks and wear just one for 4 hours and then dispose of it? Because I think it's 4 hours and then you have to throw it away. They are so dehumanizing. It is just horrific to see people's faces covered with masks. You have a look at the UK pandemic plan of 2011, they said there's no evidence or little evidence exists of saying that masks stop a pandemic. And in fact, if masks, and the majority of people in this country wear masks, you go to any town centre, particularly last year, you'll see 99% of people in masks. If masks really worked, why would cases have risen towards the end of last year? They don't work, and they spread the disease, and they lower children's immune system. You were supposed to have germs. Children are supposed to get a cold, etc. It builds up immunity. Without this, what it does to people's immune systems, I hate to think. It's dehumanizing and it's destructive to the immune system, and that is backed up by evidence.
In what way do you think that the cheap mask, for instance, or the cloth that people wear in the town center, how is that hazardous, and how does that aid transmission of the virus?
Well, there's studies been shown that the virus first of all, and I'd have to just have a look at it, or it's in my piece on it, and you can link to having a look at the studies. From what I remember when I wrote the piece, that the various studies that show that either the virus sort of clings to the mask and makes people sick, and the fact that it doesn't, because of I think it's how small the virus is, it doesn't stop the virus from being transmitted. All the masks do is basically a breeding ground for bacteria and screws with the immune system, as well as the whole ethical thing of making everybody look like drones. and dehumanizing them. So there, I have linked two studies that will be more articulate from what I'm saying at the moment. In my piece, there are many, many studies, including from the UK government themselves prior to this, saying masks just don't do nothing to stop the transmission. And how many people go home after you're wearing a cloth mask for 4 hours, washes it every time after 4 hours, and then reuses it? Very few. And those things become bacteria-ridden cloth, horrible things that, of course, are going to spread COVID. Anything dirty will do that.
What would you say to somebody who says, let's say if they live in a city where COVID rates went up, the reason why the rates went up is not because of the mask. The rates in my city went up is because people are breaking the laws and they're going over to each other's houses and they're having tea. And that's why the rates are going up.
Again, it comes down to this whole demented idea of throwing away 21st century understanding of disease. The Great Barrington Declaration, I'd go back to that, saying that people need to circulate in order for the virus to weaken. The fact that these are laws, these are rules and laws dreamt up by a bunch of people playing mind games and the Johnson junta, these are not rules that make sense. These are rules that are counterintuitive and destructive, not just to our society and the economy, but also to how the body operates when it comes to viruses. As I said, Sage themselves said lockdowns kick the can down the road. We need herd immunity. So people have got a very screwed up idea of how viruses work now, thanks to the propaganda spread by Sage and the Johnson junta.
So is your view that in order to beat COVID, we just have to have a stiff upper lip and spread COVID?
Well, I think it's doing what was done with every other pandemic prior to last year, where things that had a far worse mortality rate, where precautions were taken. Do all what Sweden did, what Texas did, what South Dakota did, take precautions. And it's very interesting. The countries with the strictest lockdowns, including the UK and South Africa and Peru, have had the highest death rates from COVID. And the countries with no lockdowns have either had, like Sweden's had a very comparative death rate to the UK, or very low rates of COVID and of mortality rate. That to me speaks volumes. So it's about 21st century medicine. First, do no harm and do what was in the pandemic plan, as Sweden did, as many other countries did, where you protect your vulnerable and you protect your elderly and let people go about their business. Viruses spread, they're meant to spread because that weakens them. You can't, how are you going to stop viruses from spreading? By keeping people under house arrest forever? It is the most insane. It's like the whole world's gone demented. You cannot do that. You can't defeat a virus. You can't stop a virus. You can't only mitigate it through tried and tested remedies of viruses, of combating viruses, which prior to 2020 was about herd immunity, vaccines if necessary. Not that I'm a great fan of the COVID vaccine, but that's another story. But what I'm saying is they're trying this thing. Nothing was about lockdowns. Lockdowns were seen as harmful to controlling a viral epidemic. This is what's so crazy.
So it seems like, on your view, the kind of elephant in the room is we can't be scared of transmission. We can't be scared of people dying of this because this is how we eventually get rid of it.
It's a virus. It's a pandemic. People will die. This is the thing, but we cannot cheat death. I mean, I think I wrote here towards the end of the piece that, we must be the only civilization in history which thinks we can cheat death on a mass scale, destroying ourselves in the process. We can't cheat death. People will die. It's an unfortunate thing. But people die every day. It's the one certainty we have in life. You cannot say, well, we have to save everybody from COVID, but then millions more die from untreated cancer throughout the world, from starvation. A famine is being predicted in the developing world because of lockdowns. You have to have a sense of perspective. We all die. It's how many die from what, which is the question here. And it's unethical, immoral, to make millions more die in order to save just a few from COVID. And also, don't forget, it's not the case numbers, but the mortality rate. And the mortality rate is low compared to previous pandemics. That's my point.
And that leads us to the next part of this piece I wanted to read, which is, quote, "The numbers dying from COVID-19, almost non-existent for the under 50s, don't support the case for lockdowns either. Yet despite evidence that such restrictions are unnecessary and ineffective, and of their destructive impact on the economy and their cost to society, the vast majority of the public have been persuaded to sacrifice their own well-being and expose themselves to other perhaps greater health risks to save our NHS," unquote. What's interesting about that is it raises the question of what obligations does the NHS have to society? Because everything is framed in terms of what obligations society has to the NHS.
A society should not have an obligation to a health service. A health service has an obligation to us. It's our health service. We're not supposed to sacrifice our lives and our well-beings to save it. There's something very wrong. I mean, a few years ago, I wrote for Conservative Women about the NHS and how it's a cult. I mean, it's a deity in this country. And if you criticize it, everybody thinks, oh, you want the American system where there's not much socialized health. No, not at all. But you want a health service that works for the majority. And this service does not. And I have, thank God, been very lucky with the GPs that I have, both, in places that I've lived in the UK. Most of the GPs I've had, including my current one, are phenomenal, are wonderful. It's not but I know how lucky I am with that. But it's the system which is just abhorrent. For example, like for myself, I'm going through the menopause and I started having some horrible bleeding 3 months ago, and spoke to my GP, and she said, I'll put you in for a scan. And I'm only getting my scan this week, 3 months later. Now, that is not normal for a health service. A woman of my age should not have to wait 3 months for a routine ultrasound to see what the bleeding is. God forbid it's something, and I know it's not. I know it's probably just menopausal stuff. But for other women like myself who are going through that, it could be ovarian cancer, that if you don't catch quickly, people will die, women die. You do not owe a health service anything. Your health service owes you to look after you. You're paying for this. Well, everyone says, oh, the NHS is free. It's not free. We pay through it through our taxes. It is not free. And it's just a very weird, I've never seen anything like this in my life, where if you criticize it, there's no nuance. I personally don't think we should have the American system, but we should have a two-tiered system like they do in countries like Malaysia. I've written about this. Like in Malaysia, those who can afford it have private insurance, and those who can't, those who can't afford it have the government insurance. But because you can choose between the two, the government healthcare is very, very good because it's not overrun. People have got a choice of whether they want to go for government healthcare or private healthcare. And so it's not overrun or under-resourced because some people choose to go private, and it's very easy to do that and not that expensive. Malaysia has a higher survival cancer rate than the UK. So, you can't say anything against the NHS in this country without being told that you want people to die and you want the American system and, there's just no nuance. So as we're seeing the result of it now, that it's been deified, and so people are now being commanded to sacrifice themselves to the deity of the NHS to save it. It's nuts.
Do you think the problem is the NHS is too privatized, even though it's a national health service?
No, I would say the problem is it's run by bureaucrats with big fat salaries, and the money's not being channeled where it should be. That's the problem with it. It's not private. Good at privatization for the NHS is not a bad thing. What is a bad thing is the way that it's run. The NHS exists it's the largest employer, I think, in Europe. It literally is existing for its employers and not for its patients. It's a whole change of ethos that is needed. And I'm talking about, this is coming from a very high, this is coming from the bureaucracy or the people who run it, the NHS managers, not your everyday nurse who's been rushed off her feet, or my lovely GP who's always there for me. I'm talking about it's a ethical issue, a systemic issue, and I've been in a few NHS hospitals, and they, in certain places they treat patients like they are just the most bothersome issues. And why are you here anyway? You're disrupting my day. Why do we have to deal with patients is the ethos of some of these NHS places. It's I've written about some of my experiences with it, and the whole ethos of it has to change.
So, do you think part of the problem is it's underfunded, or do you think it's adequately funded? It needs to channel its money in the right directions.
The latter. I mean, billions go into the NHS. Billions, and a lot of it is not being channeled in the right direction. For example, and I won't mention names, but the hospital I was in, I wrote about this for Coleman a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, I had 2 bouts of sepsis. This is what ME does to the body. And the second bout was when I was still in Canada. I came to visit my mother in London, and within a few days, I got sepsis, and I was rushed to hospital, and the emergency section that I was in was fabulous, modern, amazing. I was in my own room. I couldn't fault it. I was moved to a ward that night, and it was a horror show. A horror show. I've written about it. Dirty, horrific. I mean, I don't blame the staff that much because, they were rushed off their feet. And there's not enough nurses. Nobody cleaned. I was in that ward for a day and a half. The toilets were disgusting. There was wee and blood all over the toilets and the floor. It was, I cannot describe. I wrote about it. It was a horror show. And to me, it was about the fact that there's plenty of money. That hospital, I think, had several million given it to in the last year for refurbishments or something like that. Millions have been plowed into it for the last year before, that last year. And it was horrific. So it's not about lack of money. If you have a look at the budget over the last whatever years, every government has given more and more and more to the NHS. It's the misuse of funding, and it's not going where it should.
What do you think is the cause of this misallocation of resources? Is there an ideological problem? Is it there's not enough privatization? What's the problem that's explaining?
I'm down to my same point that I think you have a high echelon of managers, etc., being really, being paid salaries way beyond what they're worth. We only have to look at town councils. You have town council CEOs or whatever they call them being paid far more than the Prime Minister. It's just very odd. And then you have nurses and healthcare assistants being paid a tiny, minuscule amount. You can't pay an NHS manager who is literally responsible for the lack of hygiene in a hospital and therefore causing COVID to spread around in hospitals, huge fat cat salaries, and then paying a nurse very little when she's, when that nurse is actually on the front lines. There is a imbalance of how people are paid in the NHS and everything in this country. There's a real imbalance, and we see that with the NHS, as well as, the NHS, paying lots of money for a diversity officer. I'm sorry, I don't want my healthcare system to lecture me on diversity and pay someone for that. What a waste of money. I want that money to go so I can get an ultrasound scan within a month of my doctor recommending me, and not 3 months, and God forbid that there's something wrong and it's not caught in time. I mean, it's about a value system as well. What is a priority?
So do you think that disproportionate salary problem where managers are being paid way more than nurses, for instance, is that coming from the assumption that, the mistaken assumption perhaps, that managers have more responsibility?
I think if the managers did a good job, I'd have no issue with their salaries. So they do a rotten job. And I think, there's an issue with that. But I would say the biggest issue, far more than the salaries, is the ethos of the organization. What importance is placed, like, for example, it's far more important for them to have a diversity officer than it is to make sure that there are enough ultrasound scans for people. It's far more important for them to treat COVID-19 cases than it is to treat a cancer patient. I mean, the ethos is messed up, and as well as it very much exists for the employees rather than the patients. I mean, I've been lucky in terms of the care I've had from as particular NHS staff, but there are horror stories from many others who haven't been as lucky as I am. And that's because it's, the ethos isn't there. It isn't, the health service is there to protect us, to serve us, not the other way around.
Yeah. So what do you think are some of the better strategies on offer for making the NHS more responsive to the problems of the public rather than the public responsible for the NHS?
I think this whole thing about locking us down and saying save the NHS, it was beyond demented. I think it's, I think we need in this country, and we need a serious conversation of our National Health Service, and what it is not short of funds, trust me on this. You just need to look at the budget that billions go into it. It's how it's structured and where the money goes. And as well as this whole bizarre thing of shutting it down to everyone except COVID-19 patients, particularly last year. And now everything, people have been backlogged because so many people who should have been treated last year now are on long waiting lists that some might die before they get any treatment. There's something very, very wrong there.
Do you think a lot of the reason why the NHS has the problems it does is because the people who work within it don't speak up enough about the internal problems, and they're too sort of subservient to the organization?
Absolutely. They're terrified of being whistleblowers. Terrified. They close ranks. They really do. This is a huge, huge government department. It really is. It's part of the government. They are terrified. I think a lot of people are very scared of being whistleblowers. And also a lot of people, particularly in the mainstream media, are terrified to criticize the NHS in case they get attacked by Twitter mobs. I don't care, Greg. There are things in this country that are far more important than my hurt of being attacked by a Twitter mob. And that's why I write what I write.
And that, in a way, leads to something you wrote at the end of this piece that I wanted to read, which goes, quote, "As a Jew, Milgram was deeply affected," that is Stanley Milgram, the behavioral psychologist, was deeply affected by the Holocaust and sought to understand why ordinary people submitted to an authority that instructed them to inflict harm on others. In 1961, he began a series of experiments at Yale University in which a volunteer called a teacher was commanded by an experimenter to administer painful electric shocks on a learner. More than half obeyed the instructions. One teacher said he ignored the learner's pretend screams of pain in the interest of science. Some of the teachers protested and tried to lessen the pain of the learner by administering low voltages as best they could, but they could not stop or refuse to comply. Milgram found that their desire not to inflict harm was subjugated by their desire to please the experimenter and by the satisfaction gained from obeying instructions in a different situation. The teachers felt a sense of duty only to the experimenters in charge of them, relinquishing their personal sense of responsibility to this authority. Milgram concluded that ordinary people will justify their roles in a heinous process by saying they are just following orders. Now, what do you think the Milgram experiment from 1961 that you've just written about like that, what does that tell us about COVID-19 today?
A lot. I mean, basically, particularly with this whole, what I call lockdown zealots, this whole thing that lockdown, we have to make sure that everyone locks down. If you see your neighbor having a person come over for tea, you must call the police. And anybody who doesn't do lockdown are granny killers, and we hate them and they should suffer for what they've done. You know, basically what the government has done is they've terrorized people into submission, and they are making people, and as a result of that, people are obeying the orders that the government gives, even though these orders harm others. And a lot of people will say, well, it's not my fault. It's just, you know, I'm doing what the government says. The other layer to it is that people get a certain satisfaction saying, we're in a terrible situation, but aren't I being good? Look how much I'm helping society by saving the NHS by not calling, even though I've got terrible signs of cancer. Aren't I doing so well by, you know, shopping my neighbor to the police because she went shopping without, you know, because she went outside without wearing her mask, and her elderly grandmother came for tea. You know, all I'm doing is helping society. So, you know, it tells us a lot. As I said, that fear and a twisted sense of morality and duty is a heady combination, combined with the fact that you can just say, well, I had no choice. You know, this is what the government commanded, and I was doing all my best to help society. Takes away people's sense of responsibility. It plays on people's desire to be a good person in society and to please the ones giving orders. You know, the experiment tells us a lot. And people will do that no matter how much harm they're causing another, just so that they can feel that they're being good, and just so that they're told, oh, you're a good person by doing that. Says a lot about COVID. Or the response to COVID.
Yeah, what would you say to the person who says, well, look, if we don't follow those orders, then that means COVID is going to spread. The more it spread, the more chances it has to develop a new deadly mutation we can't even imagine.
It's anti-science. It's anti-science because, as 21st century medicine has proved, herd immunity is the thing that works with regard to viruses, that when it spreads, as long as you protect your elderly and vulnerable, it weakens. And so spreading it is the one thing that does help weaken it and save lives. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is, for God's sake, think for yourself. Why are you listening to the rantings of the Johnson junta and the even more insane Labour opposition party and everybody else? These politicians who are venal and corrupt and do not have your best interests at heart, why are you listening to them? Do your own research, you know, open your eyes. What are you doing? Is what I'd say to them. And I would also say, in apartheid South Africa, where I grew up, you know, people followed the law like, oh, I saw my neighbor having sex with a black man, so I'm going to call the police because of the Mixed Marriages Act. It's not allowed. And so the police would come and arrest the white women and the black man for being in love and having a relationship, because that was not allowed by the apartheid regime under the Mixed Marriages Act. You use your common sense, you know, wear a seatbelt, that makes sense, it saves lives. But, you know, it's just, people have lost their ability to judge of what is harmful and what isn't. And lockdown is the most harmful thing ever exist in Western society. It is the death knell to our Western civilization. People who haven't grown up in countries like I did, where they've always had freedom, etc., they don't understand what it's like to live with no freedom. Now they will. I can't believe I swapped one police state for another. It horrifies me.
So what would you say to, say, like an ordinary British person who says, I'm a bit confused because on the one hand, Karen, you're saying that herd immunity and spreading the virus is the key to getting it controlled and eventually getting us out of all of this crap. But whenever I turn on the television, whenever I see a doctor, the doctors are saying, no, herd immunity would kill too many people. It would take too long of a time to work. So we can't do that. We just have to prevent it from spreading. If it was the consensus, what you're saying about herd immunity, why do I never see it when I see doctors? Why do I not hear that consensus when I talk to my GP?
Because many of the doctors are part of the NHS. And as we come back to my original point, the NHS is another institution that's dominated by the left, and it is the left in this country and everywhere really want their socialist utopia and will do anything to bring it across. I can't believe doctors are saying these things, saying what they would never have said a year and a half ago. This is what, this is what astounds me. Absolutely, yes, there are hospitals that have been overrun, but that's happened in previous flu systems. Have they forgotten their medical training? Have they forgotten everything that they have taught? And a lot on the TV will be activists for the Labour Party or for the left in one way or the other as well. It's very easy to check these things. A lot of academics who are on TV are part of the left and part of this whole kind of, hatred of anything conservative and hatred of democracy, wanting to turn the UK into a socialist utopia. Look at who these people are. Don't forget things like the Sky and BBC and the mainstream media have been compromised by government money. The government has now the biggest spend of advertising in the country, in the mainstream media. When has a virus ever needed its own PR campaign like this? Human beings, we have a survival mechanism. We know what threatens us. Don't listen to it. Our survival mechanism means we stay alive. If COVID-19 was truly dangerous to the majority of us, believe me, most people who are protesting the lockdowns would be the first to stay at home. We'd sense the danger. If this was like the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, I guarantee there'd be majority of people who protest lockdown would not be protesting this. But many people sense that it's not a threat to us as much as lockdown is. We have an innate sense of survival, and our survival is being threatened not by COVID-19, but by lockdown policies and the reaction to this, to COVID-19. And I mean, when have we ever used lockdown in 21st century medicine? In contemporary medicine, it's never been used. This is why I'm saying that it is ridiculous. And I know, I had a visceral reaction to the concept of lockdown when it first came. And I often go by my instinct, by what I emotionally feel about something. And then I look to see what evidence there is. And invariably, there's a reason why I feel like this. And I would encourage anyone who still thinks lockdown is great because some NHS doctor said so, to read Michael Senger's seminal piece in Tablet magazine on what China did with lockdown, how the CCP literally shamed Western governments and the mainstream media into doing lockdown. And China is set to become the world's economic superpower now, while the West dies. And that to me speaks volumes. As I say, China, the idea of lockdown came from China. They exported it to the West via their propaganda campaign. Please read Michael Senger. I mean, he did humanity a huge favor by writing that piece of China's way of spreading that propaganda to the West. And then governments panicked. They saw one government capitulate to lockdown and then another and another. Don't forget that I suspect our own government is in debt in some way, and our institutions are, particularly academia, are in debt to the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. And they will do what China says. And China is rising in the UN. This is a dangerous authoritarian regime. And the West is in trouble. And everybody who goes, oh, lockdowns are great, are just being useful idiots for China. It suits China that the West crashed their economies. Mm-hmm. And China is set to become the superpower.
Do you think China successfully dealt with the pandemic, or do you think they unsuccessfully dealt with it? From the point of view of keeping the deaths down.
Given what we know of COVID, it's got a low mortality rate anyway. So it's not like China, if they did keep the deaths down, did anything remarkable. What China did, and I will never forget this. I remember just as it was starting last February, and I went to see my mother in London, and she herself was getting scared about COVID. And I remember just saying to her, there were images coming out of China of people dropping dead in the street or supposedly dropping dead in the street, and these doctors and nurses looking exhausted. And there were two things that struck me. One, from what my writings and from what I've written, I know the CCP is a very strict controlling regime. Nothing comes out of China without their say-so. And I remember thinking, why is the CCP allowing these images of people dying in the streets? Now we know that if you read Michael Singer's work, you will see that those were all setups by the CCP. Why are these images that are coming out? Why is China, why is the CPC allowing these images to come out? Because some people are saying, oh, it's been smuggled up. The CCP controls the internet in China. Trust me, it's an authoritarian regime, and on to the nth degree. And I remember just thinking, one, it just didn't ring true that these images were being shown from China, number one. And number two, I remember saying to my mother, I will worry when we see people dropping in the streets as we've seen in China.
So I suppose, in a way, the kind of interesting takeaway question from all of these things you've written on COVID is, what do you think is the way society should judge whether or not it dealt with this pandemic effectively, let's say 50 years into the future?
It is what has happened. It is how many people have died as a result of the response to COVID-19 and how lives have been destroyed because of it. That's what it is. It's, this obsession about keeping transmission rates low and death rates low. We know far more now about COVID than we did a year ago. We know that the mortality rate is low. We know that if you're over 65 and vulnerable with co-commodities, then you're in danger. But if you are below that age and you don't have any co-commodities, you're not in danger. We know far more about this disease than we knew a year ago. And so I think history will judge those who brought in lockdowns and destroyed the West very, very, very unfavorably.
Okay, so what do you think about the odd person under the age of 50 who starts out with a position similar to yours, gets a quite nasty version of COVID, either long COVID or something that nearly kills them, improbably, and then they suddenly jump on the lockdown bandwagon and say they were wrong, this could happen to you too, you don't want to be one of the unlucky ones, something like that.
Anyone denies that it's a dangerous, horrible illness. Well, I certainly don't. But you cannot say, well, in order to save me from getting COVID, let's destroy millions of businesses, deny people cancer treatments, smash our civil liberties, just in case I don't get sick. You cannot do that. Part of being human is taking risks. We risk every day. You risk walking outside the front door. There are many other awful, terrible diseases that we risk every day getting. You cannot mitigate the risk by destroying millions of other people's lives just to save yourself. That is the ultimate selfish thing. And I'm talking about somebody who got ME from a virus. I would never have ever wanted society to have shut down, the economy destroyed, people losing everything and dying from untreated diseases just to save me from getting ME. Never would I ever be that selfish.
Interesting. So it sounds like you and the lockdown proponent have different concepts of what it means to be selfish in this particular pandemic.
Yeah. And to be quite frank, it's about, you have to come down to numbers. Like, how many more people have had their lives destroyed and will die because of lockdown compared to getting COVID. COVID is not is not in the top 10 lethal diseases of the history of the plagues of the world. This is the whole thing. It's dangerous, yes, but it's not as dangerous as to warrant this. People get sick. It's part of being human. You can't stop that. Unfortunately, you're talking to someone who's been almost continuously sick for 14 years. I have caught every virus, every cold going, sepsis twice. no way would I have wanted everything shut down and destroyed to save me. How selfish would that be?
What would you say to somebody who says that the fear of lockdown, that the fear the public might have of not being sufficiently protected by an out-of-control strain that creates, a huge spike in deaths, that will have effects on society, on all the different sectors of society, that exceeds a temporary 1 to 2 year lockdown? What would you say to that objection?
I think that the fact that you have to think that the government's going to protect you from illness is an infantilized, destructive way of thinking. Your government is not there to protect you from illness. Your government is there to ensure you've got enough healthcare, and that the economy is healthy enough to provide the healthcare, that there's law and order, that you have the means to be prosperous if you so are able to. The government is not there to make sure that that you are shut down into house arrest to keep you protected. It is a very warped way of looking at what the government has to do. Unfortunately, the Johnson junta and state have made people feel like that. I don't blame people who feel like that. They've been terrorized into thinking this is the Black Death and that the government's job is to protect them.
This is very fascinating to me, because it sounds like you're sort of linking the kind of lockdown mainstream attitude to sort of left-wing thinking about agency and how people don't have any responsibility as individuals.
And that comes down to our beginning of our conversation of being a conservative, when I talked about personal responsibility. We come back to the Milgram experiment. That was a relinquish of personal responsibilities. We only have to look at the show, the Holocaust, of what happened when people relinquish personal responsibility. We look at apartheid South Africa, where millions of my fellow South Africans turned a blind eye to the sufferings of people under apartheid. Oh, well, it's, nothing to do with me. It's just, I'll just go about my way. Well, who cares, etc. The lack of personal responsibility is horrific. And that it's a very dangerous to create a society where personal responsibility is not a value and is seen as something that the government should be doing for us. And that's why I'm very against the left.
So is your view in general about COVID, you're responsible for getting it because you can always stay home?
No, nobody's responsible for getting sick. It's not about being responsible for getting it or not. You can't blame a person for getting an illness or not. What I'm saying is it's not a government's responsibility to protect you in terms of by destroying everything else. A government shouldn't be doing that. A government should be acting like a government and not like a police state with people, with politicians drunk on power. It's what the government has done is completely wrong. It's not our responsibility in terms of like you catch an illness and it's your fault. It's not my fault I got a virus and I got ME. That just happens. We have personal responsibility in terms of, wash your hands and, if you're sick and you have it, stay at home. Those are your things of personal responsibility, absolutely. But nobody is personally responsible for catching COVID. You can't say somebody's responsible for getting sick. What we're responsible for is our own lives and how we respond to things. And those who are saying, oh, we've got to lock down and shut everybody away, and anybody protests that wants to kill Granny, that is what they owe that responsibility. They own that responsibility. How they react to it is what we own, not for the actual event itself.
So do you think one of the sad facts of life in this pandemic is we have to be open to the possibility that Granny dying could be a precondition of COVID eventually manifesting or transitioning into herd immunity for the population?
I think that is a very important question because it becomes a part of whose life is worth more. Do we risk Granny dying for herd immunity so that the majority of people can just have an ordinary life, without too much disruption? Or do we close everything down to save Granny? But I think it's a very difficult question to answer. And having an elderly mother myself, I think she's been far more harmed by lockdown than if she would have been, God forbid, exposed to COVID in one way or the other. And I think that is somebody, 21st century medicine would be first do no harm. And I think very much what was done at the beginning of the pandemic is that Granny was killed anyway by the government. I think 40,000 elderly people died in care homes after the NHS shoved them in them at the start of the pandemic. If you're going to kill Granny, that's the way to do it. Far more people probably would have died like that than herd immunity. And so I think it's a tough decision to make. And if I had been in charge, I would have gone with 21st century medicine, the pandemic plan that there was, that yes, people are going to die, but it will be far worse on every level, and many more would die if we go into lockdown, because that is the truth of it. Hard decision to make, but it's about, making sure less people are harmed, less people die, and less people would have died, and less people are going to die if we'd done the pandemic plan, which was about herd immunity, protecting just read the Great Barrington Declaration. That's exactly what the 2011 pandemic plan was, and that's what would have happened. But you have this absolute demented response, and it's about making sure that we have some semblance of a free society left for our children, of a society that functions well, a prosperous democratic society for our children. And that is gone. That is gone now. And that's the worst of it.
Do you think that kind of this shift in thinking about COVID and the sort of infiltration of left-wing ideas into all these different public institutions is fundamentally the reason why we're not going to leave anything positive to our children that resembles what we had before?
Yes, very much so. The left is destructive. The left are fascists. The left have destroyed the West. And it's sad for somebody who's not of the West. I'm an African. I'm from Africa. To see, the Enlightenment values of the West being trashed, of the heritage of the West, of the freedoms being trashed. Even before COVID-19 hit, the freedoms in our West, like the US or Canada, in Europe and and America, were being totally trashed. Freedom of speech, particularly, gone. It's astounding to witness, and it's sad that this place, which was the West and Western values and Western civilization, amazing, wonderful place, is totally being destroyed. Even before 2020, it was being destroyed.
And do you think most of this is the left rather than, say, greedy private corporations?
Oh, absolutely. Because it's ideology, it's narrative, it's discourse. That's what's just, if you have a look, for example, we come back to the police and hate crime and hate speech, it's not big businesses destroying our freedom of speech. It's the police or the government or politicians saying, you're not allowed to say this, we're going to make it illegal for you to say this, so you can't say anything except for, and we come again into social media censorship as well. Censorship is rife. So it's not, your big fat cat industry captain who's ruined everything. It's the some civil servant who's gone, let's make a law that, or some government minister who says, you can't say this about, a transgender person. Let's make it illegal. And then we can throw people into prison for that. That's what's destroying the West.
A lot of those Westerners would say that they weren't, in most cases, advocating official censorship in the form of legal prohibitions. They were sort of advocating the stigmatization of cruel behavior, of punching down, of not having a compassionate attitude towards the downtrodden, of misgendering people and things like that. And that this is not really an infringement on freedom of speech. It's a way of making our etiquette more compassionate. Do you disagree with that?
I would say then that, and I come back to one of my original points, is that the West is compassionate. The West has a lot of good value systems that have been trashed now. I would say to anybody saying that, go to another country outside the West and see how they do things. Then it will make you appreciate everything that you have here. So stop destroying it. I would say that the moment you start to police people's behaviors and words, even just because you're trying to do it for their good and for compassion, is the moment you're trying to control other human beings for whatever reason, for whatever, you're putting in control, you're putting in censorship, rather than allowing freedom of thought, freedom of speech. If you don't like somebody, the way that they're reacting, you talk, you debate, you discuss, which we're not allowed to do anymore. So what has happened to that? We're not allowed to do these things anymore. And that is the result of somebody saying, oh, let's be compassionate and we can't say anything negative or bad. We've turned post-level Puritans have made it that we cannot say anything and against what they say is good and compassionate. They're the ones leading the narrative. And should you object, you are hounded out of your job. You are possibly arrested, sometimes thrown into jail. That to me means that we are not free, that we are in a highly censored police state type of society now. And it's frightening. It reminds me of apartheid South Africa.
Do you think being free means having the right to say kind of racist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic things without massive consequences?
Yes, we should be able to say whatever you like. Because I'd rather know that if somebody's anti-Semitic or racist than have them hide it or go underground. Do you want to create extremism? You send it underground. You outlaw what people can say and do. That's how extremism comes about, not from people's sense of patriotism, but by making people feel that they can't say or do anything that makes them feel free. And yes, people should say whatever they want and do what, unless, of course, it leads to real violence. If I say to you, Greg, I'm coming around to your house and I'm coming to shoot you with my gun. Hello, of course you're going to call the police. But if I say, I'm not quite sure that a man wearing a dress and lipstick is actually transgender, that is not something that should be outlawed. And to be quite frank, particularly as I've written many times on anti-Semitism, I'd rather hear it. I'd rather hear someone tell me how much they hate Jews, because then I have the ability, then I can debate it, then I can educate, then I can actually say, why are you saying this? Look to why that person said, and then hopefully turn them around. How am I going to change someone's mind if I say, you're not allowed to say that, and if you do, you're going to prison? All that's going to do is entrench their hatred, and all that's going to do is turn them into their own form of a victim mentality. It's nuts, it's unfree, and it's wrong.
One of the, I suppose, more potent critiques of the West that's often bandied about, maybe an alternative media more than mainstream at this point, because the mainstream is so identity politics focused, is the West runs on capitalist exploitation. It runs on threatening people with poverty and homelessness. If they don't get a job, the jobs they get can mistreat them, can pay them poorly. And so the West can only really prosper in the face of all of this identity politics and sort of cultural issue stuff if it fundamentally stops being capitalist. Do you agree with that?
Capitalism is not perfect, but it's better than socialism. And it's the best we've got. It can be, of course, improved. I like the whole thing of compassionate capitalism, where where you have, and I've written about it before. I'll have to find the piece in common where I read something that was written by an economist and talks about something, I can't remember if compassionate capitalism was the right word, but it's about, capitalism with a conscience, as we come back to people's salaries, as we come back to, helping with climate change. There are various things that capitalism can do. It's a force for good in the world, capitalism. You only have to look at places like India, where capitalism really kind of has led to a burgeoning middle-class society there, compared to looking at places that has socialism. I mean, Venezuela is a perfect example to look at. You look at Cuba, you look at many places in Africa, and I've written about this, about socialism being the scourge of Africa, where socialism is a horrific system. And I would say capitalism can definitely be improved, but it's a damn sight better than socialism.
And that brings me to the end of this piece, which I suppose makes me a bit quizzical, because it's so different to everything you've said before. So here's a quote. Although I am a Jew, I have come to the realization that Jeremy Corbyn is actually something like a savior. He is a Jesus figure. He is a figure of eroticism. I love him with all and every fiber of my being. What did you mean? Gotcha.
What?
I gotcha.
Oh, you got me, no. I thought, that doesn't sound like me at all. I was like busy scrolling down my thing, saying, have I written that? And I'm thinking, if I did write that, then I temporarily lost my mind.
That was the Culture and the Offensive podcast. This is Greg Scorzo. If you like this podcast and other material that we do at Kodo Publishing, check us out at www.cultureandtheoffensive.com. And if you're interested also in the radio play that we just finished, Love Before COVID, based on my book, Love Post-Socratic Dialogues, there will be a link below. So stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that you think are wrong or stupid or silly or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.